Welcome back, brothers and heretics of Grimhammer. Tonight's story, we're diving into some blasphemy and some heresy. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like, comment, and videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor or Dark Gods. I thank you guys for support. Y'all been absolutely killing it. Now, let's get into the video.
Varax had been raised to worship long before it had ever been taught to live. Its 9 hive citadels stabbed upward through the poisoned cloud mantle like black iron sermons, each crowned with cathedral batteries and bastion choirs of gunmetal saints. Their spires vanished into bruise-coloured smog, where static lightning walked between aerials taller than mountains, and the bells of the upper shrines tolled out the hours through curtains of ash. Below them, layer upon layer, the world descended through manufactorum tiers, processional wards, pilgrim barracks, worker warrens, reliquary vaults, corpse render plants, furnace chapels, and the endless arterial roads that fed men into labour and faith in equal measure. Every wall carried prayer, every gate bore an inscription, every street ended in a shrine, a gun emplacement, or a grave. The pilgrim roads could be seen from orbit as moving wounds across the continents. Tens of millions marched in disciplined columns under ragged, devotional banners, dragging their blistered feet through grey dust that had once been sacred stone. They came to Varax to kneel beneath the Basilica of the Emperor Ascendant, to kiss the soot-black foundations of the holiest hive, and die believing their lives had been spent in proper abasement. Priests blessed them from armoured pulpits. Enforcer cohorts beat them back into order with mauls and shock staves. Servitor haulers dragged away the collapsed and the trampled to be rendered into nutrient tallow for the kitchens of the upper clergy. Above it all, beneath the stare of cathedral guns large enough to crack capital ships, billions lived in ordered misery and called it duty. Brother archivist Halbrecht Vane had spent the greater part of his life beneath that order, kneeling not in public plazas, but in dust-choked scriptoria among parchment rot, cracked data slates, and censored records older than his grandfather's bones. He had the narrow face and hollow chest of a man who had been fed on poor rakaf and doctrinal fear since infancy. The bones of his hands showed like iron hooks beneath pale skin. Ink stains lived permanently beneath his nails. His black robes were trimmed not with wealth but with age, the hems glazed with a century's worth of candle soot and archive dust. The descent hatch beneath the western transept had not been opened in 3 generations. It took 4 key seals, a prayer cycle in High Gothic, and the blood print of a senior confessor to break the lock. The confessor in question no longer had much use for blood or fingers. He lay in an alcove above, with his throat open to the spine, eyes glazed toward the Saint statues he had served all his life. Halbrecht had found him there at the change of shift, cooling in his own robes, the access sigils missing from the dead man's chain. It should have driven him to the alarm vox. It should have brought wardens, sanctifiers, a forensic deacon, and a procession of armed oversight, brothers. Yet the ledger he had unearthed the previous night had burned all caution out of him. The hatch groaned open with a cry like an old beast being flayed. Cold air exhaled from the dark below, dry and old and touched with something stranger than dust. Halbrecht took up his lumen staff, muttered the rite of illumination, and stepped down into the catacombs beneath the Basilica of the Emperor Ascendant. The stairs were cut from black stone that the records insisted did not exist anywhere on Varax. Their edges were unworn, their surfaces swallowed the light instead of reflecting it. The walls tightened as he descended, forcing his shoulders inward until the passage became a throat of ancient masonry stained by soot that did not smear beneath the touch. Symbols had been hammered out of every lintel and floor tile. Here and there, beneath the vandal scars, he glimpsed fragments of script unlike the pieties above. Not the rigid geometry of imperial benediction, not the curling flourishes of shrine lore. These letters seemed to recoil from the eye itself, bending as though they disliked being remembered. Halbrecht's breath rasped loud in the narrow dark. Sweat crawled down his back in spite of the cold. He had always mistrusted sealed places. Catacombs taught dangerous lessons. The dead did not remain silent in history. They only waited for the living to stop listening. The stair ended at a circular chamber whose walls were blackened with an old burn, yet no heat remained. Halbrecht held the lumen higher and felt his scalp prickle. Flame lived on the stone without giving light. It ran through the soot in frozen veins, a tracery of dead fire preserved in the rock itself. He could see where it had climbed the walls and pulled across the ceiling in a tide of darkness deeper than any simple scorch mark. When he leaned close, the marks shifted at the edge of vision, as if embers lay beneath the surface, dreaming. His lips shaped the first warding words that came to him, then stopped. This chamber was older than the Basilica above, older than the first pilgrimage charters, older, perhaps, than the earliest occupancy records of Varax itself. He knew that with the same cold certainty by which a scribe knows false ink on a fresh page. Layers of masonry above had been arranged not to build over it, but to bury it, to deny it by sheer weight of holiness. In the center of the chamber stood a lectern of bronze gone green with age. Upon it lay a skin scroll inside a crystal cylinder. The seal had cracked centuries ago. Halbrecht opened it with trembling fingers and unrolled the parchment with a care learned from a lifetime of touching dead things more precious than living men. The script was ecclesiastical in form, but wrong in its omissions. Entire names had been scraped away and replaced. Dates had been redacted under invocations. Marginal notes in at least 6 different hands argued, denied, condemned, and then fell silent. In the lower third of the scroll, a phrase remained uncensored, perhaps because every later keeper had been too afraid to leave proof of erasure. Pyrocrypt of Amun-Shah. Halbrecht read it once, then again, as if repetition might render it harmless. The words seemed to stain the thought that held them. Beneath that title were references to a vault, to containment prayers that were not prayers at all, and to a sequence of custodial frauds maintained across generations of Varax's highest clergy. Whole archive shelves had been purged. Witnesses had been reassigned into silence. One cardinal had ordered the execution of his own secretaries after merely transcribing the term. Another had decreed that the lower catacombs were to be mapped falsely in all official records, their true dimensions preserved only in bloodline memory within a sealed order of archivists. Halbrecht stared at the final notation and felt the chamber grow smaller around him. The sealed order named there was his own, not by title, not by rank, by blood. His mouth dried to chalk. For a long moment he could only hear the beat of his own heart and the thin electric hiss of the lumen staff. Then came another sound, far away and above, a vibration passing through the bones of the Basilica and down into the buried chamber, like the first note of a funeral bell. Not a bell, he realized. Vox static. He hurried back through the passage, scroll clutched inside his robe, lungs burning. By the time he reached the first upper vault, warning klaxons had begun to howl through the transept levels. Red lumen globes strobed in the shrine corridors. Ecclesiastical armsmen were running toward the command cloister, with carbines half fastened and breastplates hanging open. Somewhere above, men were shouting over one another in panic. Halbrecht caught fragments as he climbed. Impossible signal. Every channel. No source lock. The western nave Vox array had been turned to full amplification by the time he reached the choir, gallery. Priests, wardens, militia officers, and screaming servitors crowded beneath the brass speaker banks, while adepts in red filter lenses tried and failed to cut the transmission. Every receiver in the hall vomited the same voice. It was not a human voice in any sense that gave comfort. It rolled through the chambers with the depth of tectonic movement and the wet scrape of something immense dragging itself over stone. The words came in High Gothic corrupted by an accent older than the Imperium's present mask. Each syllable struck like a hammer blow. Not a prayer, a litany, a declaration. Across Varax, in hab blocks, shrine courts, munitorum towers, underhive relay nests and orbital command galleries, Every Vox channel bled the same guttural scripture. Screens burst into static rhyme script that no one had keyed. Machine spirits keened. Some adepts clawed at their own ears until their nails came away red. In high orbit, beyond the cloud mantle and the ring of defense, stations, reality had already been wounded. The battle barge Maledict's sermon came through the warp with its hull aflame in colors no vacuum should sustain. It emerged not cleanly, but as if forcing itself through layers of skin. Escort cruisers followed in a procession of iron cathedrals and blasphemous murder ships, their prows carved into demon maws, their flanks crawling with weapon batteries and scripture brands hammered into the armor in lines the length of city blocks. Vox traffic from Varax's station network struck them with demands, threats, catechisms, and challenge codes. The answer was laughter layered beneath chanting. Within the grand sepulchral nave of the battle barge, Dark Apostle Malachar Vol stood before his war host. He was immense, even among post-human giants. His armor was dark crimson beneath the ash of old campaigns, carved with scriptural lacerations and rimmed in gold gone brown with scorched blood. Parchment hung from him in strips. Skulls swung from chains at his waist and clacked softly as he moved. His Crozius Arcanum was capped not with an imperial eagle, but with a snarling solar icon split by horned scripture. Where a loyal son of the Imperium might have worn purity seals, Malachar bore flayed skin cured into covenant strips and inked with the names of conquered worlds. Before him stood the word-bearers and those lesser creatures permitted to march in the shadow of their revelation. Legionaries in desecrated plate, chosen with demon faces trapped in their pauldrons. Apostles, corifice captains, diabolists, warsmiths. Behind them loomed serried ranks of cult soldiery and branded thralls packed into the gunmetal dark, while incense burners swung and filled the chamber with a sweetness that could not quite hide the smell of old meat. Malachar raised his Crozius, and the chanting died. Varax has mistaken weight for sanctity, he said, and his voice carried without effort through the vastness. It has mistaken stone for truth. It has mistaken obedience for purity. Such errors are common among the Corpse King's cattle. A low snarl of amusement ran through the assembled host. He turned, and the hollow of the world burned above the Strategium pit, its hive spires marked in red sigils. We do not come to take this planet. Conquest is for soldiers. Dominion is for kings. We come for a holier labor. His helm lenses glowed like banked furnace coals. We will rewrite it. Every tower, every reliquary, every street paved with crawling penitents, and every vault hidden beneath their lies. We shall make of Varax a living sermon. Its billions shall be our ink. Its suffering shall be our illumination. Its death shall be its first moment of honesty. He lowered the Crozius toward the world. Bring me that honesty. Then the fleet opened fire. Orbital docks died first. Boarding torpedoes screamed into the station ring in blistering waves, punching through armor belts and void shield seams with the force of divine punishment. One macro cannon bastion vanished in a bloom of fire and tumbling steel as a word-bearer cruiser sheared its dorsal spine with lance strikes. Elsewhere, boarding claws bit deep and held. Bulkheads burst inward under melter-cutting beams. Red emergency lumens flickered through decks suddenly filled with smoke, vacuum frost and roaring chain blades. Voidsmen died with their boots still maglocked to the deck. Arms spun away in frozen arcs, trailing blood globes that crystallized in the breach wind. Macro cannon crews were torn open at their stations. Rib cages burst by mass reactive rounds. Heads pulped against range cogitators. Torsos hacked apart and left steaming in the frigid dark. Some men were dragged alive into the grasp of boarding parties, only to be thrown back in pieces when the traitor Astartes were done with them. The docking arms of Port Ascendant split apart and vented thousands into space. Below, across the hive citadels, the hidden faithful of another creed rose in answer. Confessors were cut down in their vestries by altar boys old enough to shave and mad enough to smile while doing it. Water purification plants were poisoned with blood cults and industrial agents that made men cough out their own lungs in pink froth. Defense vaults sealed since the last rebellion were opened from within by labor overseers who had worn loyalty for decades as a disguise. Processional arches became gallows. Governors, judges, tithe ministers, and shrine wardens were hanged there flayed, their skins peeled down in strips to reveal meat slick and red beneath the ash wind. Halbrecht saw the beginning of it from the western clerestory. The plaza below the Basilica had been full that morning, as always, with pilgrims packed shoulder to shoulder beneath the haze, kneeling in ordered rows while sermon casters boomed from bronze minarets. Then the sirens began, then the Vox litany, then a man near the front. Rank stood up laughing with his throat cut from ear to ear, blood sheeted down his chest, and shot the priest beside him through the mouth with a concealed auto-pistol. Panic spread not like fire, but like rupture. It burst. Tens of thousands tried to flee at once. Bodies slammed together. Men went down and vanished under the press. Incense burners crashed from chain mounts and spilled sparks into the crowd. Somewhere near the martyr fountain, a heavy stubber opened up from a pilgrim cart and reaped a lane through flesh. Ecclesiarchal enforcers advanced in shield lines, barking for order, then started clubbing and shooting indiscriminately when order proved impossible. Cult gunners answered from shrine roofs and windows, turning the square into intersecting lanes of gunfire and screaming bodies. Halbrecht gripped the stone balustrade until his fingers went numb. He watched a father lose hold of his son in the surge, saw the boy disappear, heard nothing over the stampede and the gunfire, and then the crowd broke around the fountain and showed the small body crushed open, skull flattened like dropped fruit. Men crawled over one another with blood-slick hands, coughing incense and dust, only to be cut down by bursts of autogun fire that punched gobbets of flesh from backs and shoulders. The square became a slaughter trough in the space of minutes. The Vox arrays boomed again, now with greater clarity, and the entire hive seemed to lean inward to hear. Malachar Foal's voice rolled over Varax, deep as bombardment, intimate as a knife at the throat. Kneel, and your death shall mean something. Stand, and you shall still burn. The words struck with the certainty of sentence passed. Men froze to hear them. Some dropped to their knees in reflexive terror. Others screamed defiance that no one heard above the static and the prayers and the gunfire. Halbrecht felt the sound pass through his ribs and settle in his stomach like cold lead. He had spent his whole life listening to sermons. He had never heard one that hated its congregation so completely. Above the city, the sky changed. At first he thought the smog mantle had caught fire from orbital debris. The clouds over the upper hives glowed red from bombardment, and the atmosphere flashed with descending craft and weapons discharge. Then a new light split the heavens. Not the arterial crimson of the invading fleet. Not the dirty orange of burning docks or the furnace glare of collapsing habstacks. This light was colder, blue at its heart, gold at its edges. It cut through the ash clouds in geometric fractures, as if a blade of impossible radiance were being drawn across the firmament from beyond the veil. The red-lit storm above Varax shuddered in answer. Men in the plaza stopped mid-flight and stared upward with blood on their faces. Even the gunfire faltered for a heartbeat. Halbrecht felt the change before he understood it. The air sharpened. The Vox static shifted pitch. Somewhere far above the cloud layer, another fleet had entered the war. And for the first time since the sirens began, the servants of the first invader were no longer the only monsters coming for Varax. The outer defense ring of Varax did not break cleanly. It came apart in strips, in screaming Vox traffic and torn steel, in killboxes overrun by things the gun crews had never been taught to name. Orbital bastions burned above the world like censers cast from a god's hand. Voidside fortresses that had watched the pilgrimage lanes for centuries were boarded, flensed, silenced. Defense monitors slewed helplessly as grapnels bit into their hulls and traitor engines dragged them broadside into the guns of the approaching heretic fleet. Every command channel was a riot of contradictory orders, pleas for reinforcement, praise to the throne, and death screams cut short by decompression or chain teeth. Then the landing craft came down in earnest. They fell through the ash-clotted atmosphere in their tens of thousands, their descents turning the upper cloud mantle into a burning black sea. Some were heavy assault rams plated in scripture and dried blood. Some were stolen mass conveyors reworked into coffin-like troop barges. Some were little more than iron cages suspended beneath crude thruster packs, packed with howling cult soldiery eager to reach the killing ground below. Around them descended the greater instruments of the word-bearer's will, armored dropships bearing serried ranks of legionaries, cargo landers vomiting traitor auxilia by the regiment, cathedral-tall sermon towers broken down into modular sections for rapid deployment, their brass-throated amplifiers already bellowing liturgy before they touched ground. Demon engines clamped in iron harness, thrashing against their restraints as if they could smell the mass of souls awaiting them on the surface. The sky over the Basilica district became a furnace of incoming fire. Defense lasers lashed upward from bastion crowns and curtain walls, punching smoking holes through some of the descending craft. But there were too many. A lander died and came apart over the western processional quarter, showering the avenue with flaming wreckage, severed limbs, and shrieking cultists who hit the paving stones hard enough to burst like wet sacks. 3 more took its place before the defenders could shift target priority. Anti-air cannon on the eastern towers hammered until their barrels glowed, only to fall silent when boarding torpedoes struck the battlements from above and split the gun houses open. Halbrecht saw the first of the giant sermon towers come down beyond the martyr plazas. They descended on retro burners through the smoke and fixed themselves into the avenue stones with seismic claws, cracking saint-faced paving slabs and toppling processional obelisks. Their speaker horns opened like metal flowers. Their banners unfurled in the heat wake, each one stitched from red leather and painted with script that hurt the eye. A heartbeat later, the towers began to speak, and their voices rolled through the hive in crushing waves. Not mere orders, doctrine. The city was being preached at while it bled. Halbrecht was still in the western clear-story corridor when the first internal defense line failed. Shrine wardens and enforcer troops ran past him toward the inner gates, with soot on their faces and their rifles already half empty. A deacon with half his scalp torn loose staggered by, clutching his own severed ear as if it were a relic. Somewhere below, the great basilica doors groaned under repeated impacts that shook dust from the vaulting. Each blow was heavy enough to jolt the stones under Halbrecht's boots. He clutched the cylinder containing the skin scroll inside his robe and moved the other way, toward the service stairs, because instinct told him the upper sanctum was already doomed. He did not get far. The western transept had become a slaughter hall. Bodies lay everywhere, trampled pilgrims and shot enforcers mixed with priests in their ash-white robes, and choir men crushed beneath fallen pews. Incense still hung in the air, but now it mingled with propellant smoke, burnt insulation, void frost from ruptured cooling lines, and the sour heat of freshly opened viscera. The great image of the Emperor over the transept doors had lost half its face to explosive rounds. Its remaining eye looked down upon the dead with chipped stone pity. The inner gates burst inward. The men holding them were thrown back in pieces. One hit a pillar so hard his spine broke through the front of his chest in a spray of blood and shattered vestments. Another landed on his knees without his lower jaw, hands pawing stupidly at the red ruin of his throat before he fell forward. Through the smoke came the first legionary Halbrecht had ever seen in the flesh. He was enormous, a giant in dark crimson plate lacquered with soot and gore, horned scripture etched into every surface of his armor. His pauldrons bore the burning book and eye of the 17th Legion. Chains of bones and parchment strips hung from his cuirass. He carried a chain axe in one hand and a bolt pistol in the other. Behind him surged more of his kind, and behind them came the true flood, the lesser multitudes, cult fighters in patched flak armor, traitor guardsmen with flayed skin tied to their bayonets, black-robed fanatics with cleavers and autopistols, hunched servitor things driven forward by shock prods, and war engines on piston limbs dragging incense braziers and ammunition hoppers. At their head walked a warrior larger even than the rest. Corifice Dreokelt entered the transept like an execution already delivered. His armor was old enough to be hateful. Deep red plate banded in black iron, shoulders ridged with trophy spikes, a cloak of human skin parchment strips hanging from his backpack vents and licking in the hot draft of the breached nave. His helm was wrought in the image of a snarling martyr, its vox grill shaped like bared fangs. The chain axe in his fists was a brutal thing, more butcher's saw than weapon, every tooth running with old gore beneath fresh. He did not roar, he did not boast. He simply walked into the defenders and started killing. The first rank died before they understood he had reached them. His chain axe took one enforcer across the collarbone and hip, splitting armor, meat and spine in a red burst that sprayed the pillar behind. A backhand with the axe head crushed a priest's skull so completely that one eye struck the floor and rolled away, trailing optic nerve. Dreor shot another man through the sternum at point-blank range, the bolt round detonating inside his chest and spraying half-digested morning ration and lung fragments across the altar steps. He kept moving, breaking the line by force of presence and butchery alike. Word-bearers stormed after him, methodical and pitiless. One legionary seized a chanting confessor by the throat and held him aloft while his brothers shot the confessor's attendants through the face one by one. Another drove a combat blade into the gut of a militia officer and twisted until bowel loops spilled steaming around the man's boots. Cultists flooded into the gaps, stamping the wounded underfoot, bayoneting the fallen, dragging the living by their ankles toward the forming piles of prisoners. Dreor reached the high altar in less than a minute. The old cardinal of the Basilica still stood there, hands raised, voice cracking around the words of excommunication. "You are damned before the throne," the old man cried. "You tread holy stone, oath-breaker. Repent and beg the master of mankind for the mercy you—" The chain axe took him at the waist. The upper half of the cardinal remained upright for the span of a blink, still clutching his crozier, before sliding from the severed lower body and spilling a curtain of blood and organs. Across the altar steps, Dreor planted a boot on the corpse and lifted his axe high. The weapon dripped in thick arterial threads. "Witness!" he said through his helm grill, his voice carrying with machine-amplified contempt. "This is the reward of false scripture." The surviving clergy recoiled. Some dropped to their knees at once, not in prayer to the throne, but in terror before the invader. Others shouted defiance and were cut down where they stood, and some, to Halbrecht's horror, did neither. A canon master whom Halbrecht had seen officiate feast day absolutions for 2 decades stepped from behind a pillar and peeled off his stole. Beneath the white cloth, he wore another vestment, red and black, marked in symbols hidden until that moment. He bowed to Dreor not as a conquered priest, but as a servant receiving his superior. From the side chapels emerged more like him, senior confessors, reliquary keepers, scriptorum deacons, men who had spent their lives denouncing, heresy from the pulpit now bearing hidden catechism tattoos, speaking old responses in voices trembling with zeal. The Basilica had not merely been attacked from without, it had been waiting to betray itself. Halbrecht backed into the shadows of a side corridor, nausea washing through him so sharply that he bit the inside of his cheek and tasted blood. He knew some of the faces kneeling before the invaders, men who had corrected his script, men who had assigned him work rotas, men who had heard his confessions. Their mouths now formed rites he had never been taught, praises directed not to the throne, but to the ruin of everything he had served. "Bring the unbelieving to the square," Dreor ordered. "Hang the loudest from the processional arches, skin the exemplars. Crucify the rest in rows enough to be seen from the upper towers." He turned his helm slightly, and for an instant Halbrecht felt the giant's gaze pass over the darkness where he hid. Yet the corifice moved on, already thinking in terms of districts, Resistance pockets, kill zones. The Basilica had been broken. Now it would be displayed. Halbrecht fled into the lower service arteries, through dust-choked passages and maintenance crypts that stank of machine oil and old incense. He passed a choir dormitory, where the boys lay dead in their bunks, throats cut with devotional knives. He passed a cistern chamber, where the water had turned pink and then red, a slick froth of poison and blood running over the grates. He passed a vault door hanging open on melted hinges and saw arms crates being hauled out by labor gangs, screaming praises to gods they had concealed in silence for decades. He made the eastern egress and reached the street, only to find the city above transformed into a vision of ordered damnation. The processional avenues were rivers of fleeing bodies hemmed in by flames. Devotional banners burned on every archway, their gold thread saints curling into black lace in the heat. Corpses lay so thick in places that the paving stones were hidden under meat and cloth and brass shell casings. Some had been shot while running. Some were hacked apart where they knelt. Some were displayed. Halbrecht saw a governor hanging upside down from an arch, his skin peeled to the fingertips, ribs spread like a butchered carcass. He saw a file of enforcers nailed through palms and throats to the doors of their own precinct house. He saw cult boys, no older than seminary novices, calmly pouring promethium through the ground floor windows of a shrine hostel, while the men trapped inside beat bloody fists against the bars. The sermon towers never ceased, their booming voices braided with the constant thump of artillery and the shriek of descending landers. Every few streets, squads of traitor auxilia established cordons and herded civilians into lines under gunpoint. Beyond them rolled demon engines, iron abominations on crabbed limbs and grinding treads, their hulls covered in warding chains and parchment strips, their weapon muzzles breathing smoke like nostrils. One bore a caged thing fused into its frontal armor, a face or the memory of one, screaming continuously as its cannon traversed and fired. Halbrecht had gone less than a quarter mile before they caught him. 3 cult fighters emerged from a smoke-wreathed alley, all of them masked in blood-smeared scarves and wearing torn fragments of clerical vestment over their armor. One leveled an autogun. Another seized Halbrecht by the robe and spun him hard enough to crack his shoulder against a wall. "Seal rings," the third said. "Look at his hands." They saw the archive sigils set into his fingers, the old bronze rings of office worn by the sealed order. Recognition changed them at once. What had been ordinary predation became eager purpose. "Alive," said the one with the autogun. "He goes to the apostle." Halbrecht fought then, more from horror than courage. He struck one, across the nose with the lumen staff, and heard cartilage break. Another jammed a rifle butt into his belly and folded him over. Boots hit his ribs. A hook-ended prod caught the back of his robe and yanked him sprawling into the blood-slick street. He swallowed a mouthful of copper and ash. Hands dragged him upright. A blow split his brow and filled one eye with red. They bound his wrists with wire and hauled him through the district at a stumbling run. He was taken through streets becoming ritual space. Pilgrim quarters had been emptied and reset into geometry. Whole hab clusters were being forced into lines by armed cultists and barking auxilia sergeants. Men were arranged in files of equal number. Banners marked routes. Loudhailers barked responses for the crowd to repeat. At first, Halbrecht thought they were merely sorting prisoners. Then he saw the pattern from a rise in the avenue, and his gut went cold. The lines did not lead to camps. They led to pits. Great excavations had been opened in plazas, market squares, and disused foundation lots, some with machinery, many with explosives, all now ringed by sermon poles and braziers. At each pit knelt ranks upon ranks of civilians, forced into synchronized prayer. They repeated the same litanies in timed cadence under threat of gunfire, voices rising and falling, like the breath of some planetary beast. Those who faltered were beaten or shot, and their bodies rolled into the excavations. Those who kept pace were marched onward by the thousand toward the next station in the sequence. A ritual grid. Varax itself was being measured in obedience and blood. Halbrecht was dragged at last into the shell of an administratum courthouse that had become a forward sanctum. Its marble columns were blackened by fire. Its floor was slick with tracked blood. Incense braziers smoked beneath stained frescoes, already defaced with fresh scripture. At the far end, before what had once been a magistrate's bench, stood dark Apostle Malachar Vol. He seemed even larger than in the Vox transmission, not merely because of his armor, but because everything around him bent toward his presence. Legionaries stood at either side like execution statues. Lesser clergy knelt below the dais, hands spread in reverence, some still wearing imperial robes turned inside out to show the hidden script beneath. Malachar's crozius rested against one shoulder. Its mace head was crusted with blood and brain matter. When Halbrecht was thrown down before him, the apostle did not speak at once. He looked, not at the wounds, not at the fear, at the man. Brother Archivist Halbrecht Vane, Malachar said at last, pronouncing the name with grave care. Not a prisoner then, a witness. Halbrecht spat blood on the floor. I witness only blasphemy. A murmur ran through the kneeling cult clergy, half outrage, half admiration for the attempt. Malachar's helm tilted by a fraction. All conquests begin with that. A word on someone's lips, he said. Blasphemy, heresy, desecration. The defeated always imagine they have named the thing that destroys them. It comforts them. It lets them believe there remains a law above force. He descended one step from the dais. The brass trim of his armor was dark with drying gore. You are learned. That is why I will not waste you on the first pit or the nearest arch. Listen well. True conquest is not military, it is theological. Cities fall every day across this corpse empire of yours. Bastions burn, fleets die, governors are shot and replaced. Such things are transient. They are logistics. A world is not truly taken until its meaning is broken and made to kneel. Halbrecht stared up at him, forcing the tremor from his voice. What lies beneath the Basilica? That won him a rustle of amusement from the gathered traitors. Malachar made a low sound in his helm, not quite laughter. There it is, he said. The honest question. He gestured, and one of the hidden catechist priests stepped forward, bearing a data slab and a folded sheaf of copied records. Halbrecht recognized his own hand in the marginal notations. The skin scroll had already been found upon him and read. The pyrocrypt of Amon-Shah, Malachar said, and the name seemed to darken the very air. A chamber buried beneath lies piled upon lies, not a shrine, not a relic vault, a flame prison, older than the current mask worn by your Imperium, older than most of the dogma by which it herds cattle from cradle to grave. He leaned closer. Halbrecht could smell incense, old blood, sacred oils turned rancid in the heat of war. I intend to open it, Malachar said softly. I intend to feed it. 1 billion souls would be a fitting tithe. Enough agony, enough worship, enough fear made vocal in one place, and the world itself shall become an offering. Halbrecht's mouth went dry. You would burn the planet. I would reveal it. Malachar straightened. The weak imagined fire destroys. Fire clarifies. Fire separates devotion from pretense. Beneath sufficient flame, all doctrine becomes honest. Outside, through the broken arches of the courthouse, artillery thudded. A tremor passed through the floor. Somewhere in the city, a tower collapsed with a distant grinding roar. One of the legionary officers at Malachar's side received a burst of vox through his helm and turned slightly. My lord, he said, augur relays from the fleet. Malachar did not look away from Halbrecht. Speak. Enemy vessels threading the engagement zones. Their formation is changing between scans. No consistent vector. No conventional line of advance. That pulled the apostle's attention at last. He turned his helm toward the officer. Explain. Ships moving in impossible geometries, the legionary said. They are not breaking our line. They are appearing within it, emerging where no trajectory permits. For the first time, Halbrecht heard something like irritation in Malachar's silence. The air in the chamber shifted. Ash drifting through the broken arches no longer fell. It eddied upward in lazy spirals, drawn toward the ceiling, as though the world had forgotten its own weight. The braziers guttered. Every flame in the room shrank to a cold blue point for the space of a breath. Across the avenue outside, a stone saint, fixed to the courthouse facade, began to weep a dark red fluid from its eyes. It ran down the weathered cheeks in slow blood trails. Men noticed. Some cultists gasped in ecstasy and fell prostrate. Others crossed themselves in broken memory and then recoiled from the gesture. Halbrecht stared at the blue flames and felt a deeper terror than he had known during the assault. The city was no longer merely under attack. It was changing its rules. Malachar lifted his head, as though scenting a rival predator on the wind. Then the Voxnet screamed, not with static this time, but with silence forced so hard it became a sound. Command channels went dead across whole sectors. Defense bunkers reported nothing because there was no one left in them to speak. In the eastern bastion quarter, in the sub-level sanctums beneath the broken Basilica, in orbital relay crypts and governorial shelters and sealed command chapels, something was arriving without crossing the ground between. Halbrecht saw the first manifestation through the broken archway. In the avenue beyond the courthouse, where a squad of word-bearer auxiliaries had been marching prisoners toward a pit, the air folded inward. A circle of blue-gold light flashed across existence, sharp as a cut gem. Dust froze in place. Sound fell away for the span of a heartbeat. Then figures stood where there had been none before. Armored giants in cobalt and gold. They did not roar praises. They did not exhort. They simply were, as if they had always occupied that exact portion of reality, and everyone else had merely failed to perceive it until too late. Their plate was baroque and immaculate, even amid the ash storm, gilded crests and scarab sigils catching the cold witchlight still lingering in the air. Their eye lenses burned lambent blue. In their hands rested inferno bolt guns and long warp flamers bound in sigils of old sorcery. The auxiliaries had just enough time to turn. Then the rubrique opened fire. Bolts struck like miniature suns. Men came apart in chunks of armor and meat, rib cages bursting outward in sprays of red mist and bone splinters. One prisoner vanished in the crossfire, reduced to a sheet of wet fragments that slapped the avenue stones. A warp flamer exhaled, and blue fire rolled over the nearest cordon line. Flesh blackened, split, and turned glassy, while the victim still screamed. One cult overseer clawed at his own face until it came away in burning strips. More of the silent revenants appeared farther down the processional road inside a chapel ruin, atop a barricade, within a pillared vestibule that had held a word-bearer command post moments earlier. Each arrival was instantaneous. Each brought murder. Inside bunkers and basilicas across Varax, the same cold miracle repeated itself. The second invader had come not as a screaming tide, but as precise damnation falling exactly where it wished. Malachar watched the slaughter with stillness like a coiled blade. At last he spoke, and the words were heavy with recognition. The sons of Prospero. Outside, one of the blue and gold giants turned its helm a fraction toward the courthouse, as if it had heard him across the roar of guns and the screams of the burning. Then it advanced through the blood fog with the measured certainty of a revenant from a colder, better-ordered hell. Menkora Setep did not regard Varax as a battlefield in the crude sense that lesser warlords understood battle. He did not see front lines, attrition tables, or merely the collision of armies contending over ground. Those were the thoughts of butchers and logisticians, necessary minds perhaps, but not elevated ones. Varax was a miscalculation, a theorem interrupted by ignorance. A buried engine had been found by zealots too enthralled by their own shrieking piety to grasp what they had unearthed. And now the world convulsed under the tread of fools who mistook revelation for mastery. He stood within the sanctum deck of the Akempton's Grief, while the vessel coasted through the burning traffic of the upper war zone, its hull washed again and again in the red glare of weapons discharge. Around him rose concentric rings of brass pylons and hanging crystal lenses, each one turning slowly in the dimness like the components of some impossible astrolabe. Sorcerous fire burned in braziers set into the deck, though no fuel fed them. The air smelled of old parchment, charged metal, and the dust of books long dead. Rubrici stood at the chamber's edge in perfect stillness, their cobalt armor dimly luminous in the low light, their crests and gold trim untouched by the frantic ruin of the battle beyond the hull. They waited without impatience, because there was nothing left within them that could sour into it. Manara looked through the viewing aperture and past the visible world. His physical sight showed him the obvious: Varax turning beneath a skin of cloud and soot, orbital docks burning like opened wounds, defense stations tumbling in silence after their atmospheres had vented into the void, word-bearer cruisers advancing in blasphemous confidence among shoals of wreckage. Yet it was the second sight that mattered. He opened his awareness and let the veil become thin. At once, the planet changed. The hive citadels no longer seemed like cities. They became glyphs. Their processional avenues were lines in a greater character. Their pilgrim roads were arteries drawn with deliberate symmetry across continents. Beneath the vast architecture of worship and misery, beneath manufactoria and ossuaries and shrine vaults, something older burned. It was not fire in the primitive sense. It was equation, a psychic calculus engine wound into matter and memory, buried under generations of concealment and false sanctity. Manara saw layers of warding like the nested steps of a proof. He saw soul pressure and devotional mass redirected through civic design. He saw that the world itself had been laid out to feed, focus, and eventually awaken the thing in its core. He smiled very slightly behind his helm. A weapon theorem, he murmured, not a relic, not a shrine, a theorem given flame. The aspiring sorcerer Iset Kur stood at his right hand, helm tucked beneath one arm, his shaven scalp inscribed with fresh wards in silver ink. His face was handsome in the cruel, narrow manner common to the gene line of Prospero, though ambition had sharpened it past beauty and into something avian, witch-light reflected in his eyes as he watched the occult display hanging above the strategium pit. "The apostle has found a blade and taken it for a god," Iset said. "As expected," Manara replied. He raised one hand, and the suspended holomap of Varax changed, no longer showing districts and altitude bands, but chains of luminous nodes pulsing under the planetary crust. Vox hubs, shield relays, archive towers, ritual concentrations, places where the word-bearer's infection had begun to spread order through frenzy. A lesser commander would have called for the broad hammer. Mass landing, armored spearheads, saturation fire. Manara despised the broad hammer. It left ignorance intact beneath rubble. He pointed with one gauntleted finger. "Silence these Vox nexuses. Burn out their relay sanctums and leave the lower machine crypts intact. I want every surviving signal sample harvested." Another point. Break these shield coordination towers. Not the generators. The coordination matrices. Let the local fields collapse unevenly and isolate their defense rings from one another. Another. These archive spires, take them by teleport insertion. Kill every priest, every lex mechanic, every keeper of maps. Strip memory from the living before death claims it. There will be records below their records. Runes spiraled outward from his gestures, carrying the commands through the chamber and into the mind circuits of the waiting covens. No shout was required, no sermon. The instructions were exact, and exactitude was obedience of the purest kind. Iset watched the changing map in silence for a moment. "We could let the word-bearers spill themselves against the world," he said at last. "They have already committed deep. Their cult armies will flood every avenue and square. Their zeal will do the work of disassembling Varax for us. When their strength is spent and the defenders broken, We descend and take what remains. Manara turned his helm a fraction toward him. That is how the carrion-minded think. To wait for zealots to exhaust themselves upon a discovery born of disciplined law. His voice remained level, but the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop around it. No, they do not understand what lies beneath that world. Their rites are ignorant pressure. Their devotion is contamination. Every moment the 17th are allowed to shape this war, the equation degrades. Iset inclined his head, though the submission in the gesture was too smooth to be pure. As you decree, exalted one. Manara looked back to the witch-sight image of the planet. Deep in its core, the buried engine pulsed once, like the opening and closing of an eye beneath ash. I do not decree, he said. I correct. The first correction was delivered within the quarter hour. In the Eastern Command Bastion, 3 stories beneath a battery line still firing toward low orbit, the relay officers never heard the teleport strike begin. One moment, they stood amid vox chatter and tactical projections, sweating in stale recirculated air, while damage reports flooded every channel. The next, blue-gold light carved a silent geometry through the command chamber, and the rubrique of the second cohort was simply present. No roar announced them. No challenge was given. Inferno bolts took the relay masters first. Their torsos burst in dense red fog, organs and rib fragments striking hololith screens hard enough to crack them. One officer lost both arms at the shoulder to a single mass-reactive round and fell screaming over a console, pumping sheets of blood across the runes. A warp flamer hissed once and rolled witchfire across the chamber. Skin blackened, tightened, and split. Eyes boiled in their sockets. Men who had never seen Astartes before died clawing at their own faces as their flesh vitrified and their bones cooked beneath it. By the time the blue fire guttered out, the Bastion's relay sanctum was full of statues. Human, forms locked in their final panic, glossy and cracked like kiln-fused pottery, smoke still curling from their teeth. Elsewhere across Varax, the same precise murder unfolded. Rubricae advanced through gunfire along shrine corridors and processional roads, taking hits that would have crippled lesser transhumans without even the courtesy of reaction. Solid rounds sparked from ceramite. Lasfire painted red scars across cobalt plate. Grenades burst at their feet and filled the air with marble shards and strips of burning cloth. They did not speak. They did not flinch. They moved with sepulchral purpose, bolters barking in measured cadence while mortal defenders screamed prayers and died in chunks. At the Vox Basilica of Saint-Geron, a mob of militia and armed laity attempted to hold the stair with improvised barricades and a pair of belt-fed stubbers. The rubrique came through the fire as if walking through rain. Inferno rounds struck flesh and masonry with equal contempt. Bodies flew apart. One man's head came off in a red spray so dense it painted the Sant statue behind him from chin to crown. Another had his belly opened by a bolt burst and stumbled backward, dragging steaming loops of intestine through the shell casings, before the next shot took his chest apart. Then the warp fire came. It touched the barricade and turned wood, cloth, flesh, and iron into one shrieking ruin of blue light and bubbling bone. At the archive tower of the Upper Sepulchre district, Manara's designated kill team descended by teleport directly into the restricted stacks. There the fighting was brief and intimate. Priests in white archive robes died with their hands still full of data scrolls. Lex mechanics had their cranial sockets torn out by Kopesh blades. One old scholar survived long enough to be seized by an aspiring sorcerer who pushed gauntleted fingers into his temples and peeled location chains, mnemonic locks, and half-forgotten coordinates from the meat of his mind. The man's eyes burst before the extraction was done. Blood ran from his ears in thin black lines. His corpse dropped twitching to the floor, while data photisms spun above the sorcerer's palm like captive fireflies. That pattern repeated through every secondary catacomb and hidden archive the Thousand Sons could identify. They did not merely kill, they harvested. Memories were flensed from the living. Family lines, forbidden routes, sealed chamber dimensions, burial rosters, old renovation discrepancies, oral fragments preserved in the minds of frightened clerics who had never understood the importance of what they had memorized. Every mind was another codex forced open under pain. Manara stood at the center of it all through mind link and scrying flame, receiving the fragments as they came. Shards of truth assembled themselves within him. A concealed stair under the western transept. A vanished map index redacted 4 generations earlier. The title, Pyrocrypt of Amonshar, repeating through multiple archive branches like a buried thorn. Bloodline custodianship among lower clergy. A brother archivist named Halbrecht Vane carrying unauthorized extracts from a forbidden ledger. Manara paused over that name. A vision thread unfurled, thin and pale as tendon. He followed it through the hive strata and saw not the man himself, but the wake around him. Panic, flight, capture, transfer through streets already becoming ritual kill grounds. Then the presence of another will, vast and furnace dark, closing over the trail. The cleric lives, Manara said. Iset, standing beside the scrying bowl, inclined his head. Then he will not live for long. Manara's gaze did not move from the fire. He is too valuable for the apostle to butcher quickly. Halbrecht Vane is both key and bait now. Then we take him. We take him when taking him yields the greater opening. He reached out with his mind, seized a command relay corrupted by the word bearers, and forced a channel through its shrieking machine spirit. Static bucked. Runes cracked and reformed. Somewhere in the Basilica district, a sermon tower howled in protest as its own vox organs were turned against it. The connection held. Malachar Vol answered with no attempt at concealment. The word-bearer's presence on the channel was like heated iron dragged across bare nerve. "You pray to what you do not understand, Apostle," Manara said. The reply came at once. "And you mistake understanding for ownership, sorcerer." Around those words, artillery boomed, men screamed, and machine static choked the channel with the sounds of a city being murdered. Manara let the silence stretch a fraction. "The fire beneath this world was not built for your kind." Malachar's laugh was low and abhorrently calm. "Everything burns for my kind in the end." The channel died under a surge of corrupted liturgy. Manara did not waste emotion on the exchange. It had confirmed what mattered. The apostle knew enough to be dangerous and not enough to be trusted with another moment's freedom. He committed his elite then. The processional avenue had once been a boulevard of triumphal penance, wide enough for mass pilgrim parades and lined with saint colonnades, confession arches, and martyr fountains. Now it was a charnel corridor beneath burning banners. Thousands of civilians had died there since dawn, and more were still dying, trampled underfoot or shot by cult cordons when terror broke their lines. The dead had been crushed by traffic and shelling until the avenue surface was a red-brown paste of blood, powdered marble, ash, and pulped human matter. Through that mire came the main body of the word-bearer counterstroke. Cultist tides first, shrieking praises and firing wildly as they ran. Behind them came traitor auxilia in more disciplined ranks, flak-armoured and bayonet-fixed. Among them bounded possessed, warping around, their own armour, limbs elongating and retracting in wet snaps, faces splitting into lamprey maws and horned grimaces. Demon engines pounded forward on piston limbs, belching smoke and shell fire, their armour plates hammered with blasphemous text and chained reliquaries full of screaming things. Waiting for them in the avenue's centre stood ranks of rubricae and the scarab occult. The terminators were monumental, ancient plate-crested and gilded, Kopesh blades hanging at their sides, combi bolters held with the calm inevitability of execution instruments. Manara watched through their eye lenses as the enemy closed. Then the slaughter began. Inferno fire tore lanes through the first wave, blowing cultists apart by the score. Heads burst, chests caved outward, arms spun away in arcs trailing blood. Yet the rear ranks pushed over the front, driven by devotion, terror, and the sheer weight of bodies. They slammed into the rubrique line and died there by bayonet, blade, and close-range bolter bursts, but their dead created footing for those behind. Possessed struck next, faster than mortal sight. One leapt high and landed atop a rubrique, talons punching through cobalt plate to rip loose an arm and half the breastwork beneath. Another opened along the torso like a split cocoon, vomiting a rope of teeth and muscle that wrapped around a Terminator's helm and crushed until the gold faceplate caved inward. The scarab occult answered without a word. Khopesh blades rose and fell. One possessed lost both legs at the pelvis and kept clawing with its hands until a bolter round removed its spine in chunks. Another took a force stave through the open mouth and exploded from within, showering the front ranks with chunks of rib, black blood, and burning organs. Demon engines crashed into the melee like runaway altars. One shell burst among the scarab occult and threw marble, gore, and fragments of blue armor high into the air. Another drove its drill limbs, threw a pair of rubricae and lifted them writhing on spinning iron. Warp flamers answered. Blue fire washed over iron hulls, and the cult infantry sheltering beside them. Men blistered and burst. Their armor fused to their bodies. The avenue became a kiln and a slaughter pit together. So much blood soaked the processional road that the powdered marble beneath turned to slick crimson mud. Men slipped in it and were trampled flat. A cult banner-bearer fell with both legs blown off and disappeared beneath the boots of his own side before he had finished screaming. A scarab occult Terminator crushed a man knee-deep into the mire with one step, pulping pelvis and spine with an audible crack, then buried its Khopesh in the skull of a charging fanatic so hard the blade bit into the paving below. Every saint statue lining the avenue was splashed red. Some toppled under shellfire and smashed the dead flatter still. Manara did not delight in the carnage. Delight was for the unstable. He measured it, adjusted it, and turned the battle by fractions. A voxed impulse redirected a flank of rubricae into a side chapel from which cult gunners had begun enfilade fire. A whispered formula through the mind link blinded a demon engine's bound pilot spirit, sending it careening into its own rear ranks. He was not in the avenue physically, yet his hand was in every precise correction. Then the flames around the dead began to speak. Only he heard it clearly. Not words, not truly, but the rearrangement of probability as heat danced over broken bodies and burning banners. The war below the surface, the theorem reacting. Manara focused his sight through the blood fog and the pyres and saw beyond the present clash into a future echo cast by the buried fire. Varax opened. Not symbolically, literally. The hive world split from crown to core like a skull struck by a god's hammer. Continental plates peeled back in molten segments. The 9 great hives became broken teeth around a wound of impossible light. From the planet's center rose a sun that no heavens had birthed, a godless star of ash and screaming geometry, illuminating the void while fleets burned around it like insects circling a sacrificial brazier. Manara held the vision for a single cold breath, then severed it before it could feed on him further. This was no longer correction by conquest alone. This was an equation racing toward catastrophe, and if it was to be solved, it would be solved at the heart of the world, with fire on all sides and no forgiveness left in the galaxy. War took Varax in layers. What had begun in the Basilica district as panic, betrayal, and sacrilege spread outward until all 9 hive citadels became distinct organs of one dying beast, each convulsing according to its own wound. In the upper spires, void shield galleries and noble bastions became vertical sieges fought from stained galleries and hanging causeways where men fell screaming through a mile of smoke and chapel bells. In the manufacturing belts, trench lines were hacked through ash dunes and cooling slag, with labor gangs and defense cohorts crouched behind conveyor housings while demon engines shelled them into red ruin. In the underhive transit arteries, ambushes erupted from maintenance vents and sump shrines. cult knives flashing in the dark, las bursts strobing over pipes furred with rust and devotional mould. In the pilgrim barracks, where millions had slept in ordered wretchedness beneath the eyes of Saint-Icons, mass uprisings became stampedes, pogroms, and butcheries by cot row and mess tier. By the 4th hour of invasion, no district remained untouched. By the 6th, no man on Varax could still believe the war might be contained. The world had not been struck. It was being eaten from the inside by faith gone rabid, and from the outside by transhuman wrath. Captain Rest had not slept in 30 hours. That fact ceased to matter the moment he saw the state of the surviving defense map. Sleep belonged to men who still possessed the luxury of a tomorrow. He stood in the shadow of a crippled Lehman Russ command tank at the edge of the southern processional ward. Soot ground into the creases of his face. Blood caked black on one sleeve where a Vox serf had died against him during the withdrawal from St. Corian's gate. He was thick-shouldered, greying at the temples, and long past the age when the primer posters imagined officers. His left eye had a habit of twitching when under artillery strain. It had not stopped twitching since dawn. The men around him were the stripped-down remnant of what had once been a planetary defense army. Half-strength line companies. Militia pressed into uniform so quickly that many still wore shrine rags under their flak vests. Stubber teams with one feed belt between 3 guns. Chimera crews who had lost their infantry support twice over. Sump fighters and ash haulers handed rifles and told to die in the proper direction. Rest had spent the last 3 hours pulling them into some approximation of a front while the world disintegrated by district and by prayer. His adjutant, a narrow-faced lieutenant named Soren, with one ear torn half away by shrapnel, leaned into the side of the tank and held a blood-smeared slate up to him. "Northern Avenue is gone," Soren said. The pilgrims broke the barricades in panic when the cult guns opened from the shrine roofs. "We have enemy armor moving through the breach, not ours." Rest did not look at the slate. He could hear the Northern Avenue. The sound carried over the bombardment, screaming, tracks, and the hard repetitive cough of mass reactive weapons. The Western line collapsed. The Basilica route. Soren hesitated for the span of half a breath. "No route, sir." There it was. No route. No clean lane back to sanctified ground. No reserve line. No measured tactical withdrawal. Only districts falling away into sacrificial geometry and murder. Rest wiped a hand across his mouth and tasted ash. Then we strike southeast through the Avenue of Martyrs and cut for the central rail trench. We hold there until there is no one left to hold it. Soren stared at him as if to confirm he had heard properly. "That line is clogged with refugees, sir." "Everything is clogged with refugees." "The avenue will be a slaughter." Rest looked at the men gathering around the tank, pale faces behind rebreathers, exhausted eyes. A loader quietly vomiting beside an ammunition crate, and then wiping his mouth and carrying on. He thought of the command vox telling him to preserve combat effectiveness. He thought of the cardinal who had blessed his regiment on feast day and was likely now a red smear under a heretic's boot. He thought of the emperor, though not with any certainty that the master of mankind still looked as far downward as Varax. "It will be ours then," Rest said. "Move them!" The counterattack began beneath cathedral guns that no longer answered to loyal hands. Rest's armor columns lurched forward first, treads grinding over shell casings, devotional rubble, and the dead. Infantry moved in broken ranks around them, laser guns at the ready, some muttering prayers, some too empty for prayer. Smoke had thickened so badly through the lower avenues that it became texture rather than weather. A black choking soup shot through with sparks and embers. Las fire stabbed through it in red needles. Heavy stubbers hammered from blind angles. Somewhere ahead, a fuel line ruptured and ran burning promethium down the gutter channels in orange streams. The first bodies under the tank treads were pilgrims. There were too many of them to avoid. Whole families crushed into the paving during earlier panics, single limbs protruding from heaps of robes and devotional packs. Faces flattened into the stone, mouths still open. One child's hand clung to a St. Token, even after the rest of him had been reduced to a dark slick under the track plates. Rest looked once, and then made himself stop looking, because a commander who let every dead unknown claim a piece of his mind would be unmade before the hour was done. The avenue of martyrs widened ahead, lined with statues of warrior saints and processional arches, from which now hung a different breed of martyrdom. Flayed governors swayed in the heat. Enforcer sergeants had been nailed upright to the columns with their own shock batons punched through wrists and throats. A choir master had been split from sternum to groin and spread open like a butchered carcass, his ribs wired apart so that prayer slips could be hung from the bone. Then the cult guns found them. Autogun and stubber fire raked from upper hab windows and shrine balconies. Red tracer slashed low over the tanks. A forward squad disappeared in a burst of fragmentation, men tumbling apart into limbs and red mist. Rests. Lead Chimera slewed sideways when a rocket struck beneath its track guard, blowing a crewman out through the top hatch in a wash of flame. He landed on the avenue stones with both legs afire and clawed at himself while his own squad ran past. "Forward!" Rest voxed. "No halts, no bunching. Break their nests and keep moving." His men answered because there was nothing else to do. Lasguns barked back. Stubber teams dropped to one knee behind tank holes and laid fire into the shrine fronts. Grenade launchers thumped. Marble saints burst apart in clouds of white dust and stone shrapnel. Cultists toppled from balconies trailing blood. One of Rest's sappers charged a doorway with a satchel bomb under his arm and vanished in the detonation, taking the gun nest with him in a gout of smoke, brick, and body fragments. For 3 blessed minutes, it almost resembled a battle of mortal proportions. Ugly, confused, winnable by nerve and weight of fire. Rest even allowed himself the thought that the rail trench might yet be reached. Then Corifice Dreor Celt came through the smoke. There was no flourish to his arrival, no challenge. One moment, Rest's right flank was exchanging close fire with a barricade line of traitor auxilia. The next, something huge and red-black was among the first rank, and men were no longer dying like soldiers, but like penned animals under a slaughterman's blade. Dreor's chain axe rose and fell with workmanlike precision. Each blow had the awful efficiency of a butcher who did not hate the meat, only understood its purpose. A lieutenant in carapace breastplate was split from shoulder to hip, his heart bursting free in a spray of blood as the axe tore through. A Vox operator disappeared from the waist up beneath a backhand sweep, his lower body staggering 2 more steps before collapsing in a heap of steaming entrails. Dreor drove forward without pause, bolt pistol barking in one fist, every shot a detonation in a human body. A sergeant's head vanished into red fog. A trooper trying to drag a wounded man to cover lost both legs at the knees to a mass-reactive burst, and then had his chest crushed beneath the corifice's boot as the giant passed. Rest saw men who had held under artillery break at the sight of him. Not because Dreor shouted, because he did not. There was no berserker madness in him, only cold inevitability. A predator in a slaughter pen. "Hold!" Rest roared. "Bring him down, damn you! Bring him down!" Plasma fire spat from the left flank and burst against Dreor's breastplate in a flare of blue-white heat. The giant staggered half a pace, turned, and put a bolt round through the gunner's face. The man's head came apart like rotten fruit. A crack missile struck Dreor square in the pauldron, blowing shards of ceramite and parchment from his armor. He kept coming. His chain axe bit into the turret ring of a chimera, tore free in a shower of sparks, then came down again through, the commander climbing from the hatch, splitting helm, skull, and spine in one shrieking arc. Rest fired his sidearm at the giant because principle demanded it, though he knew it was absurd. The rounds sparked harmlessly from old warplate, etched with scripture and gore. Dreor looked at him then. The corifice crossed the distance in 3 colossal strides. Rest drew his saber more from reflex than hope. A guardsman threw himself between them, screaming the Emperor's name, bayonet leveled. Dreor shot him through the mouth and caught the body as it fell, shoving it aside in a wet tumble of blood and broken teeth. The chain axe rose. A shell landed 30 yards away and changed the geometry of the moment. The blast threw Rest backward off his feet, ears ringing, mouth full of grit. He hit the paving hard enough to lose the pistol. By the time he clawed himself upright, the avenue had become a rout. Men were running, tanks were burning. Dreor Celt strode through the smoke, killing those too slow or too brave to flee. His red silhouette half lost behind curtains of black dust and atomized blood. Overhead, the war grew stranger still. Blue-gold light walked the upper walls of the avenue. Stairways in adjacent hab blocks folded on themselves like bending paper. A shrine tower leaned sideways without falling, its windows now opening onto the wrong side of space. A gun platform on the 5th tier fired one final volley before its metal sheathing turned to glittering crystal around the crew. The men inside beat at their own encasement, while their skin crazed and split beneath the transparent prison. Their screams carried thinly through the smoke until their lungs failed. Stone saints lifted their heads and turned towards sounds no human ear could hear. One great angelic statue at the end of the avenue shed its wings, not by breakage, but by motion, stepping from its plinth with marble eyes burning blue. The 1,000 Suns had laid their sorcery over the district like a second architecture, and reality bent because they demanded it. Rest saw it only in glimpses before another wave of cult fire drove him toward cover, but the omen of it spread panic faster than any shelling. Men could endure bullets. They could not endure stairways that became jaws and walls that forgot which side was inside. Elsewhere in the Basilica district, Halbrecht Vane was being marched to a lesson. The cult guards drove him with rifle butts and hooked staves through side streets slick with old blood, past courtyards where kneeling captives repeated blasphemous catechisms under the eyes of chanting clergy, past pyres fed with holy texts torn from shrine libraries and hurled into the flames still bound in their iron casings. His wrists were wire-bound. His face was crusted with dried blood from the blow that had split his brow. The skin scroll cylinder was gone from him, but not before he had memorized enough. Fragments of route, references to lower, thresholds, a notation about a sealed descent masked behind a reliquary crypt. Not enough to open the whole truth, but enough to feel its outline. They brought him to one of the conversion pits in a plaza, once dedicated to sainted child martyrs. The saint figures had been toppled and smashed. In their place rose sermon poles draped with flayed skins stitched into long, ragged banners. Men and women knelt in rings around the excavation, while a black-robed officiant recited responses from a brass-bound tome. The pit itself was already half full. Bodies lay within it in layers, some shot, some hacked apart, some neatly dismembered at the joints and stacked with ritual care. Blood had soaked the earth into dark paste. Flies seethed in it despite the heat. Prisoners were brought to the lip in groups of 10. A catechist asked each the same question, an oath to the true powers, to the revelation of ruin, to the denial of the corpse on terror. Those who managed the words, even through sobs and terror, were dragged aside to be branded and collared. Those who refused were not simply killed. Halbrecht watched a shrine warden lose both hands at the wrists before his throat was opened and his body shoved, writhing into the pit. He watched a militia corporal disemboweled by ritual knives while the crowd chanted around him. He watched an old confessor, spine still straight in defiance, cut apart with methodical patience while the officiant named each severed piece and its corresponding blasphemy. When the officiant saw Halbrecht's archive rings, he smiled with bloodless delight. This one will be given a better audience. The better audience took the form of iron doors below a profane chapel, a holding vault warded not by sanctity now, but by corruption. Halbrecht was thrown inside with half a dozen other captives deemed useful enough to preserve for later questioning. The chamber had once held reliquary cases. Now its shelves were stacked with confiscated records, ritual implements, sacks of taken seal rings, and bodies awaiting identification. The air was sour with dried blood, incense, and the copper reek of opened flesh. Somewhere beyond the walls, he could hear chanting and the intermittent roar of artillery. Then a new sound entered the district. Not the bellow of word-bearer sermons, but the crackling snap of displaced air and the deadened boom of teleport arrival. Menkara's scarab occult terminators descended into the Basilica quarter like verdicts. They appeared within side chapels, choir crypts, processional halls, command bunkers and shattered vestibules, each teleport strike marked by a brief corona of blue-gold light and a taste of iron on the air. Their advance had no frenzy to it. They butchered by geometry. Incense smoke and blood mist swirled around them as inferno bolters boomed and khopesh blades rose in precise arcs. Stained glass shattered beneath detonations and became glittering powder in the air, mixing with atomized blood until every corridor glimmered red and jewel-bright. Cult sentries died where they turned. Word-bearer auxiliaries were cut in half across altars and stairwells. A possessed brute trying to force its way through a transept arch had both arms severed at the elbows by twin khopesh strikes, and then took a bolt burst through the face, blowing teeth and horn fragments halfway across the nave. At almost the same moment, Sabran the Diabolist began his own answering rite. He stood atop the steps of a broken confession hall, surrounded by bound victims and opened skins. His armor was black-red and greasy with old sacrificial oils. Servo arms held sheets of flayed human hide open, while cult scribes inked blasphemies across them in arterial blood. Sabran stitched the skins together with gut cord into long scripture scroll banners and raised them over the artillery park where demon-bound shells waited in brass racks. One by one, he pressed lesser warp things into iron casings and engine, housings, forcing them down with ritual knives and snarled invocations until the munitions trembled, eager and hateful. Siege pieces that had been mute metal a moment earlier began to breathe smoke from between their plates. One tracked artillery carriage shuddered as eyes opened in the barrel shroud and rolled wetly to regard the world. The vault doors above Halbrecht thundered with impact. Bolter fire, then the shriek of something heavier, then the grinding impact of chain blades and armored bodies colliding at close range. The chamber lights flickered blue, then red, then died entirely for a heartbeat before emergency lumens bled in weak and smoky. Halbrecht heard cult guards shouting, then screaming. Heard a voice booming scripture in a tongue that sounded like iron dragged across stone. Heard another voice answer, not with chant, but with a single clipped command in a language older and more exact. The door burst inward. The first thing through it was a cultist's upper half, thrown with such force that it struck the far wall and left a red fan of organs and splintered bone. The second was a word-bearer legionary retreating step by step, firing his bolt pistol one-handed while his other arm hung severed at the elbow. Blue-gold light flashed behind him. A scarab occult terminator entered through the smoke and struck once. The khopesh blade took the word-bearer through collar, throat, and opposite lung, opening him almost to the sternum in a gout of blood so hot it steamed in the chill teleport afterglow. Then the chamber became a butcher's aisle. Word-bearers countercharged from the adjoining corridor, red armor slamming into cobalt and gold at arm's length. A chain blade chewed sparks from a Terminator's breastplate and then bit deeper, teeth shrieking over ceramite before a force stave crushed the attacker's helm sideways and pulped the skull within. Bolters fired too close for sanity, turning men into bursts of meat and armor fragments. One possessed creature leapt over the threshold and landed atop a rubrique, claws punching through the helm. The rubrique did not cry out. It simply burned the thing point blank with witchfire until both were a knot of blue flame and blackening flesh. Halbrecht crawled. No one in that chamber cared about him for those few murderous minutes, except as a piece of ground over which the dead piled. He rolled beneath an overturned shelf, while bolt rounds smashed reliquary caskets above him and showered him in bone dust and splintered brass. A legionary stumbled backward over his legs, with his guts hanging out in steaming loops. The man fired once more into the melee, and then fell hard enough to burst his own intestines over the floor. Halbrecht gagged, shoved the corpse aside, and saw it then. The half-burned slate case on the floor by the shattered archive rack, its clasp broken, parchment fragments spilling out. He snatched it. Inside were copied extracts from the confiscated records, not complete, but enough. Route markers, liturgical falsehoods cross-referenced against real catacomb dimensions. A partial key map to the deeper vault levels beneath the Basilica. Enough for a man with memory and desperation to find the lower descent if he lived long enough to try. A word bearer crashed across the shelf above him, split open from groin to sternum, and convulsed his last over Halbrecht's boots. The brother archivist forced himself forward through blood, broken glass, and the twitching dead. He reached the side door while the giants were still tearing each other apart in the main vault, slipped into a narrow service passage, and ran bent double with the slate case hidden under his robe. Behind him, the Basilica district continued to choke on war. Wordbearer sermons boomed across avenues where Thousand Suns sorcery bent walls and stairways into impossible angles. Demon-bound artillery barked from shattered plazas. Rubricae kill teams moved through choir crypts and reliquary halls like silent revenants. Cult mobs surged and broke. Defense remnants died by the 100 in alleys and on shrine steps. Somewhere above, Captain Rest's counterattack bled itself into the paving of the Avenue of Martyrs beneath the tread of Dreor Celt and the sorcerous sabotage of Prospero's sons. Halbrecht found the old stair by accident and terror together. It lay behind a cracked ossuary niche in a side crypt beneath the south transept, just where one of the copied route marks had implied a void in the false wall records. The niche gave way when he shoved against it, stone grinding on older hinges. A throat of darkness opened beyond, breathing cold air up from below. Not crypt cold, not the grave chill of buried masonry. Something older, drier, waiting. He looked back once. Through a high slit in the crypt wall, he could see only a sliver of Varax above. Sky black with ash, lit by artillery blooms and the cold blue-gold flare of sorcery. The sound of the war had become so vast it no longer resembled separate battles. It was a single planetary note of butchery beyond counting, millions of voices and guns and engines and prayers ground together until the whole world seemed to roar through clenched teeth. Halbrecht clutched the partial key map to his chest, stepped through the broken niche, and began to descend, while the city above fed itself to gods, equations, and fire. The corridors beneath the Basilica narrowed as they descended, becoming less like the underworks of a hive cathedral, and more like the inner arteries of some long-dead thing that had refused burial. Halbrecht Vane had gone by touch for what might have been an hour or a day, his sense of time broken by exhaustion, fear, and the absolute dark between the occasional sputter of his failing lumen. He moved through dust that had lain undisturbed for centuries, and past walls engraved with symbols that should not have existed beneath an imperial shrine. More than once, he thought, he heard the war above him as a distant muffled pulse, but even that faded deeper below until only his own breath and the scrape of his boots accompanied him. Then the dark ahead acquired shape. Blue-gold witchlight washed over the passage in a slow pulse, revealing the walls, the dust, the old fire scars like fresh bruises on stone. Halbrecht froze. He knew at once that this was not the red furnace glare of the word-bearer's profane occupation. This was colder, more exact. The light did not flicker like flame. It hovered with intention. He turned to run and found the way behind him occupied. Rubricae stood in the passage mouth, 3 of them, cobalt and gold made sepulchral beneath the vault dark, eye lenses burning with dead azure lambency. They did not rush him. They did not level their weapons with mortal haste. They merely advanced, inferno bolters held in absolute readiness, the dust of the underways stirring around their greaves. Halbrecht had seen them in the district, above only as silhouettes through smoke and murder. Here, close and undeniable, they were worse than any bellowing butcher from the 17th. No living breath fogged the grill of their helms. No anger announced itself in movement. They were the memory of warriors, still marching centuries after the men inside them had ceased to be men in any comprehensible sense. A voice came from the darkness beyond them, calm as a blade laid on an altar. "Do not waste your last mortal strength on flight, Archivist. My brothers are patient in ways your species rarely survives to understand." Exalted sorcerer Manara stepped into the witchlight, staff in one hand, his other palm open and low, as if addressing a frightened animal, rather than a scholar caked in blood and crypt dust. He had removed his helm. His features were severe, long-boned, with the beautiful cruelty of a sculpted death mask. Runes glimmered faintly beneath the skin around his temples. His eyes held too much light, and none of it resembled mercy. Halbrecht clutched the stolen slate case tighter under his robe. "If you wanted me dead," he said, hearing the ragged thinness in his own voice, "you would not have spoken." Manara's gaze shifted minutely, taking in the movement of Halbrecht's hand toward the hidden case and seeing through the gesture as though flesh and cloth were no impediment at all. "No," he said, "I would not." The Rubricae took Halbrecht without violence because violence was unnecessary. One seized his wrist with a gauntleted hand that felt cold even through the cloth and bone of him. The grip was not cruel. Cruelty implied heat. This was merely final. They marched him back through the underways and into a chamber so old that even the Basilica above had likely been built in ignorance over its existence. Witch lamps floated there in slow, silent orbits, brass cages holding captive fires that burned with no smoke. Their light shone over blackened walls and on the cinders of men who had died hard and recently. Word-bearer auxiliaries, by the look of the remnants, burned down to ruptured cuirasses, glassed vertebrae, and heaps of grey-black ash that still retained the vague shape of kneeling corpses. The air smelled of ozone, old stone, and cooked marrow. Manara dismissed the Rubricae with a gesture. They did not leave the chamber. They simply became still again, posted at the edges like monumental funerary figures. Halbrecht was forced to his knees in the center. The partial key map was drawn from beneath his robe without the sorcerer even stooping. It floated through the air between them, held in unseen force, pages and slate fragments trembling in the witchlight. Manara did not examine it at once. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the chamber among the Rubricae. Halbrecht watched him in silence because there was little else left to do. The Thousand Suns Lord passed between those silent armored forms with a familiarity more intimate than command. His gauntleted fingertips brushed a pauldron here, a breastplate there, a helm crest marked by old campaign scars and powdered marble from the war above. He spoke to them in a voice lowered from lordly command into something near a private right. "You held the western transept," he said to one, and though no reply came, Halbrecht felt the words land with the weight of remembrance. "You crossed the threshold first, as you did upon Helioret, when the bone towers burned and the false saints called for our extinction." He stopped before another. This one bore a fissure across the faceplate, where some old blow had struck, but not broken through. "Your hand was always steadier than mine, Menes. You mocked my patience when patience was still a luxury of youth." Still no answer, only stillness. Yet Manara continued as though the dead-filled suits heard every syllable. "Forgive the indignity of this age. Forgive the dust. Forgive what was done to you in the name of salvation." Halbrecht felt then the true horror of them. Not servitors, not enthralled automata. Brothers, men once living, thinking, proud, condemned now to endless war as dust and trapped while bound within armor. The cold hauteur he had imagined in the thousand suns from the streets above was not emptiness. It was grief refined past display. Manara turned back toward him. "You see only armor," he said. "You should learn to see tombs." Halbrecht laughed once, a dry and hopeless sound. "I have seen the 17th flame men alive in the plazas and call it revelation. I have seen your silent dead burn soldiers into statues and walk through them without pause. Tombs, apostles, sorcerers. You are all carrion wearing different colors." For the first time, something like honest interest touched Menkaura's expression. "No," he said. "We are distinctions your species cannot afford to ignore." He came closer. The witch lamps drifted lower, casting moving bands of light over his face and over the cinders spread across the floor. "You think the Apostle and I are kin because both our hands are red. This is the laziness of prey. The word-bearers kneel to appetite and call it devotion. They do not seek to know. They seek to drown. They would feed a theorem with blood until it forgot itself and became another slavering altar." He crouched before Halbrecht, bringing their faces almost level. The sorcerer's eyes were not hot. They were colder than hatred. "Faith is a chain. Knowledge is a blade. Both cut. Only one can be guided." Halbrecht held his stare with all the strength he had left. "And what has your blade guided you to, Lord of Dust? This?" He looked pointedly at the silent ranks surrounding them. "Your brothers entombed and emptied. Your legion damned by its own cleverness. The Apostle burns worlds and names it worship. You name your ruin understanding. I fail to see the nobility." Menkora was silent for a span, not offended, measuring. Then he rose and extended one hand. Halbrecht tried to recoil. The rubrique behind him closed in half a step and froze again. Menkora's fingers never touched skin. The force of his will did instead, entering through brow and eye and memory, like a blade of cold fire. Halbrecht screamed. The chamber vanished. He was a child kneeling in a scriptorum alcove, while his father, also an archivist, whispered that some records were not to be copied by daylight. He was older, sealing false maps into official stacks under the supervision of a confessor whose smile never reached his eyes. He was descending the hatch beneath the western transept, seeing the black walls, reading the words, "Pyrocrypt of Amonshar" from Skin Scroll, running through smoke and slaughter, hiding the stolen slate under his robes, every memory stripped raw and offered up under sorcerous force. Menkara took them and hissed as the wards hidden inside them struck back. The first backlash hit him when he reached the image of the blackened chamber beneath the Basilica. A lash of formless heat came through the memory, not burning flesh but scorning mind. Symbols he had not yet fully passed exploded behind his eyes. He staggered half a pace, the witch lamps spasming in their orbits. Blood ran in a sudden thin line from one nostril. He did not release Halbrecht. The second intrusion went deeper, toward bloodline duties, mnemonic locks, liturgical falsehoods, taught across generations of Varax's hidden custodians. There, the punishment sharpened. Menkara saw the descent route as a series of turning calculations, and at the instant of comprehension, felt something immense and buried notice him. Pain like molten glass drove through his temples. His vision whitened. The chamber around him shook as a pulse of power cracked one of the hovering lamps and sent brass fragments spinning across the stone. Halbrecht collapsed, coughing and retching blood. Menkara straightened slowly, every line of his body rigid with controlled fury. One gauntleted hand went to the side of his head as if he might physically hold the pain inside. Iset Kur entered the chamber at that moment, helm under one arm, a smile almost concealed behind concern. "My lord." Menkara turned his gaze on him, and the lesser sorcerer immediately lowered his head further. "The wards punish precision," Menkara said. "A crude design, but effective. Every stolen path scorches the hand that takes it." Iset's eyes flicked once toward Halbrecht. The kneeling archivist, shaking and half-blind with pain, must have seemed a very fragile pivot for so much effort. "Then the answer is audacity," Iset said softly. "Strike now. Break the lower wards by massed force. Let the pyres above and the dead below meet in one opening blow. While the Apostle still arranges his flocks into lines, we claim the engine entire." Menkara wiped the blood from beneath his nose with the back of one gauntlet and looked toward the vaulted ceiling as if listening to the war through layers of stone. "You confuse speed with mastery, Koor. The word-bearers are already reshaping the equation." He lifted one hand, and witchfire unfolded above his palm, into an image of Varax seen through second sight. 9 hive citadels, lines of movement, nodes of chanting pressure and sacrificial focus, the city itself becoming liturgy. Above ground, Malachar had abandoned the pretense of ordinary conquest. Across hab blocks and pilgrim barracks, through manufacturing sleeping tiers and infirmary wards and ration lines and worker pens, entire populations were being driven into synchronized chant. Loud hailers bellowed call and response rites from sermon towers. Cult enforcers beat the rhythm into those too terrified to keep pace. Men knelt in stacked hab rooms packed so tightly, their shoulders touched wall to wall, reciting the same blasphemies until their throats bled. On long avenues between shrine towers, chained files of civilians were marched in cadence from one pit to another, each station demanding a different litany, a different confession, a different measured cry of surrender. Every syllable fed the growing warp resonance under the hives like blood dripping into a basin. And at the pilgrim fields, Dreyor Celt turned multitude into fuel. The fields had once been a broad expanse of devotional camps and processional grounds outside the second hive, where millions slept beneath canvas, iron sheds, and open ash-choked sky while waiting their turn at the Basilica route. Now icon towers wreathed in crimson fire had been planted in geometric rings across the grounds, and beneath them the crowd had nowhere left to flee. Rest's broken remnants and local militia had tried to pull some order from the panic. They died first. Dreyor walked the front of his line with his chain axe low and his bolt pistol smoking. Behind him came traitor auxilia, black-robed zealots, heavy stubber crews, and skin banner priests screaming praise to ruin. Then the shooting began. Massed fire raked the packed pilgrim masses. Men and boys folded in rows. Limbs flew. Blood sheeting from the front ranks slicked the trodden ground into red mud. Those who turned to run found the flanks enclosed by burning icon towers and cult cordons. Those who dropped to their knees found that kneeling brought only slower death. Dreyor's legionaries moved among them with chain blades, axes, knives, and bolter muzzles, working with hideous efficiency. The pilgrim fields became a basin of screaming flesh under crimson light. Pits filled. New pits were dug with shell bursts and machine claws. The smoke rising from that massacre was not ordinary smoke. It writhed with faces. Manara watched the spectacle through a cult sight and understood then, with cold and growing revulsion, the true shape of Malachar's purpose. The apostle does not merely seek the fire, he said. Iset said nothing. He could see it too now in the suspended image. The resonance patterns beneath the hives no longer fed toward a simple opening. They were contaminating the buried theorem with rhythm, agony, worship, and demonic pressure. They are changing it, Manara said, drowning a calculus engine in devotion until it remembers itself as sacrament. The thought disgusted him more deeply than fear. A weapon theorem, elegant in concept, turned into another shrine for barking lunatics and their warp scavenger patrons. It was precisely the kind of desecration the 17th would mistake for transcendence. Iset's mouth tightened. Halbrecht, hearing only fragments through the pounding in his skull, still understood enough to feel a bleak flicker of vindication, monster rebuking monster for the impurity of monstrousness. Manara looked down at him. You will walk again, archivist. You will show me what memory will not yield. Halbrecht spat blood onto the stones at the sorcerer's feet. I would sooner guide the apostle. Manara's expression barely changed. No, he said, you would sooner survive. That, more than any threat, struck close. He was not wrong. Survival had already made a hypocrite of Halbrecht in 100 small ways since the sky first broke over Varax. The witch lamps dimmed all at once, not extinguished, narrowed. Their flames shrank inward until each became a thin lance of brightness around a point of perfect dark. Manara's head snapped upward. Even the rubricae seemed to alter, though only by the suggestion of some tension passing through the dead armor. Across the stone floor, every shadow lengthened toward the same unseen point beneath and beyond the chamber. The omen rolled upward through the world, in manufactorum trenches and noble vaults, in underhive sump chapels and blood-wet plazas, in command bunkers and mass graves and shrine naves already half fallen, every flame on. Varax burned black at its core. Candles, promethium torches, engine fires, muzzle flare, funeral pyres, warp flame. Even the red blaze of the icon towers on the pilgrim fields acquired a heart of lightless void. Men stared into their campfires and saw darkness burning at the center. Priests forgot their litanies. Cultists screamed in ecstasy. Soldiers crossed themselves with shaking hands. Demons prowling the edges of breaches recoiled as if scenting an older predator below. And every shadow, no matter its source, stretched downward. Not east or west, not according to the lamps that cast it. Toward the buried vault, toward the hidden fire, toward the thing under Varax that had begun, at last, to answer the billions dying above it. By the time the black-hearted flames spread through all 9 hives, no honest tongue on Varax could still call the conflict an invasion. Invasion implied an enemy arriving from without, a host that struck gates, breached walls, seized ports and towers, and then drove inland by measured stages. What consumed Varax had already passed beyond such mortal shapes. The world was not being conquered. It was being translated into catastrophe. From orbit, the hive planet resembled a furnace grate under the hand of a mad god. Entire districts burned in rings and spirals too deliberate to be accidental, while elsewhere shelling had punched crater chains through upper habitation stacks and shrinewood terraces, opening the insides of the city to vacuum, fire, and a rain of falling bodies. The void around the planet had become a second war. Hulks burned above the atmosphere in tumbling trails of molten debris. Macro cannon flashes beat across the dark. Boarding torpedoes and assault craft still crossed between ships already half ruined, because even with the world below dying in all directions, the fleets of the word-bearers and the Thousand Suns had not ceased trying to blind, cripple, and outmaneuver one another. Wreckage rained constantly. Every hour birthed a new storm of metal, fuel, and broken corpses from the heavens. On the surface, billions were in motion, not with purpose, not with discipline, with panic. Pilgrim roads that had once carried endless ordered misery towards sanctified submission were now vast human floodplains choked with screaming columns of refugees. Hab populations poured from breached towers in black rivers. Manufacturing work gangs fled with furnace ash still caked in their lungs. Barrack wards emptied. Infirmaries were abandoned. Underhive sump clans dragged their ragged belongings through maintenance arteries, only to find those arteries already packed with the displaced and the dying. Millions were armed by desperation or by design. Loyal militia officers handed out rifles to men who had never fired beyond festival drills. Cult preachers distributed shotguns and cleavers to those willing to kill in the name of revelation. Pressed labourers dug up old trench lines and loaded belt-fed guns until their hands bled. Boys old enough to lift a carbine became soldiers because there were no longer any categories left between child and corpse. They died in columns. Word-bearer cordons machine-gunned refugee lines when the movement of bodies failed to conform to the ritual flow imposed over the avenues. Where panic broke the cadence of the pilgrimage marches, heavy stubbers opened from sermon towers and scythed through the packed masses until the screaming reformed into orderly files. The purpose was not merely slaughter. The suffering itself fed the rite. Malachar's war had become liturgy, and every burst of gunfire was another spoken syllable in the prayer of planetary ruin. The Thousand Suns killed differently, but not more kindly. Mankara's projected pathways toward the buried vault had become increasingly precise, and the sorcerer would not have random panic interfere with the geometry of his descent. Refugee columns crossing key routes were cut apart by inferno, fire, and disciplined volleys from rubricae kill lines. Entire Hab crowds were redirected into dead ends by illusion and terror, only to be incinerated when they threatened to choke a transit corridor needed for teleport triangulation. To the sons of Prospero, the mortals of Varax were not congregation, they were interference, human static across an elegant theorem. Captain Rest saw the last hope of soldierly order die around the Magrail Canyon. The canyon had once been one of the great arteries of the Second Hive, a vast sunken trench of track lines and maintenance ledges down which mass transit engines had hauled pilgrims, labourers, promethium drums, ration barges, munitions crates, and corpse hauler chains. Now the rails below were twisted by bombardment and buried under a litter of derailed carriages, smashed loaders, collapsed service bridges, and an uncountable mulch of dead. The canyon walls rose high on both sides, broken with access stairs, shrine alcoves, and maintenance galleries that now made perfect tiered firing positions. Rest had chosen it because it offered structure. Structure, fields of fire, and a chance to anchor the fragments of his army against the formless tide consuming the city. What remained to him was no longer an army in the old sense, but it was still coherent enough to die like one. He had tanks hull down behind the broken lip of the western access. Heavy weapon squads were dug into maintenance cubicles, blasted open by shell fire. Stubber nests had been emplaced on the ledges. Grenadiers crouched in the wreckage of a derailed mag train whose roof had been turned into a firing platform with sandbags and prayer cards. Sappers had mined the lower tracks with whatever explosive stock they had managed to seize before the depots fell. The regimental banners were gone. The priests were gone. The command voxnet was a patchwork of static and shouted field frequencies. But the men still answered when Rest barked an order, and so the shape of soldiery endured a little longer. He moved along the line with soot on his face, and blood dried hard on his greatcoat. Every few yards another man recognized him, and straightened fractionally at the sight. They needed that. A commander at the line. A human face among all the transhuman ruin. Check your fields. Hold fire until they show in full. Nothing wasted. Nothing blind. He said it again and again. Not because his men did not know the rule, but because hearing a rule still spoken made the world feel briefly governed by something other than nightmare. Then, the frontal assault came. Word-bearer artillery opened first, corrupted siege batteries hammering the canyon walls with shells that screamed as though something inside them still hated confinement. Ferrocrete burst in slabs, whole ledges sheared away and avalanched downward, taking gunners and ammunition belts and shrieking defenders with them. One bunker mouth collapsed on a full squad, burying them alive beneath shifting stone. Their muffled pounding carried through the vox for almost a minute before the weight above them settled and the sound ceased. Demon engines advanced through the smoke behind the barrage, iron beasts on grinding tracks and piston limbs, their hulls covered in brass scripture, skin banners, and bound things that clawed beneath their plating. Where their guns struck the canyon edge, men ceased to be men. Bodies burst into red paste against walls or vanished beneath choking slides of rubble. Then came the infantry tide. Cult masses first, packed so tightly their dead were trampled into the advance, screaming praises through blood and cordite smoke. Traitor auxilia behind them in harder ranks, disciplined enough to keep pace and fire in volleys even as the front lines vanished under loyalist return fire. And behind them, taller, redder, more deliberate, the word-bearers themselves. Among them moved Corifice Dreor Celt, his chain axe hanging low and dripping blackened blood from earlier butcheries, stride unhurried despite the storm of lass fire and shell bursts ahead. Rest gave the order. The canyon answered with everything it had left. Lass fire filled the trench with red stabbing light. Heavy stubbers hammered until the barrels smoked. Crack grenades rolled down the access slopes and burst amid the first cult ranks, tearing men apart in sprays of limbs and black-red mud. Mines blew under the lower tracks and tossed bodies, rails, and carriage fragments high into the smoke. For a few precious moments, the frontal assault broke against the line. The loyal guns cut lanes through flesh. The canyon floor became a reeking basin of blood, powdered stone, shell casings, and severed limbs. Rest believed, not in victory, but in delay. Delay was enough. Delay was duty. Then the air behind his line folded. Blue-gold light flashed over the maintenance ledges and the rear transit platforms. Rubricae appeared among the ammunition stacks and medici stations, their arrival so sudden that men turned with weapons half raised and died before disbelief had left their faces. Inferno bolter fire punched through command personnel, loaders, the wounded laid out on tarps, all with the same serene contempt. A triage station vanished in blue flame. A heavy weapon team trying to swing its gun around was burned into glossy ruin where it crouched. Scarab occult terminators materialized atop the shattered roof of the magtrain wreck and began firing downward into Rest's own rear ranks, every shot a precise execution. Caught between the frontal hammer and the teleport knife, the last coherent army of Varax was crushed. Rest saw his adjutant Sabran vanish in a burst of ignited meat when warpfire washed through the Vox post. He saw one of his tanks pivot desperately to engage the rear threat, only for a word-bearer melter strike from the front to turn the turret interior into white-hot vapor that vented from the hatches in a scream of steam and burning crew fragments. He saw men trying to flee down the canyon floor only to be mowed apart by cult fire from ahead and inferno rounds from behind. A sergeant planted the regimental standard improvised from a signal banner and a pipe length into the rubble and rallied a dozen men around it. Seconds later, a demon shell burst overhead and buried the whole knot under broken ferrocrete and a rain of human viscera. Rest drew his sidearm and his saber because he had run out of categories larger than defiance. He shouted for the inner ring to hold, for the rear ledges to be retaken, for any squad still hearing his voice to close around the command tank wreck. The words sounded heroic in another life. Here they were, little more than one man refusing silence. He got 20, perhaps 30 of them around him before the trap closed in full. The 1,000 Suns did not relish the kill. They advanced through the smoke with cold exactitude, warp fire boiling armor, igniting, promethium runoff in the gutters, and turning the access stairs into blue-white crematoria.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Men who had survived the word-bearer shelling died with their hands fused to rifles and their skin splitting into glassy flakes. On the opposite rim, Dreor Celt led the 17th over the broken lip and into the shrinking loyal pocket, chain axe rising and falling with that same methodical contempt Rest had seen before. Men were no longer fighting a battle. They were being processed. Elsewhere, all over the hive world, the apocalypse kept widening. The 1,000 Suns unleashed controlled pyromancy across entire habitation tiers. Mankara's covens drew lines of fire through crowded districts with the precision of scribes crossing out text. Blue-white flame raced along ventilation systems, through shrine facades, over hab balconies, and beneath market vaults. Armor boiled on men's backs. Promethium reserves ignited and ran like rivers through lower streets, setting the dead and the half-living alight together. Whole districts became ordered crematoria, their towers burning from within in calm vertical bands, while the avenues beneath filled with smoke so thick it moved as a living thing. The word-bearers answered with desecrated artillery and deeper blasphemy. Sabran the Diabolist tore the first great breach open above the fourth hive's underworks. He stood amid a circle of flayed skins and bleeding captives, chanting through split lips, while his acolytes hammered iron spikes into black stone and packed the gaps with bones. When the veil finally split, it did so not in thunder, but in a soft, wet sound, like flesh giving way under a surgeon's blade. The demons that came through were thin as famine and fast as rats. They spilled into the ruins in leaping packs, all talons, hooked spines, and lamprey mouths opening where no mouths should be. They went first for the wounded. Men pinned under rubble had time to scream only once before the creatures were on them, stripping meat from bone with frantic, efficient bites. A guardsman, with both legs trapped under a fallen lintel, was reduced to a steaming ribcage, while his hands still clawed the ground. A medici orderly trying to drag survivors from a collapsed shrine was taken from behind and opened from neck to groin in a gush of hot organs. The demons moved on while the bodies still twitched. Deep below the surface, Halbrecht Vane finally understood what Varax had always been. He stood in a chamber where the walls bore both blackened fire script and design marks hidden under later pieties, staring at the partial key map, while the tremors of the dying world passed overhead like distant heartbeat and bombardment together. The root fragments aligned now with what he had seen in memory and in fear. The 9 hives were not merely cities grown by history and need. They had been placed, aligned. Their processional roads, shrine concentrations, labour pits, pilgrim barracks, transit canyons, and cathedra all formed sigils when mapped against the strata beneath. Population density itself had been part of the design. Billions living, suffering, praying, breeding, dying, all in the correct configurations for centuries. The population had never simply inhabited Varax. It had always been fuel. He felt the realization like ice driven into his ribs. Every feast day, every census, every procession, every theological lie. The world had been built as a dormant engine, and the people fed into it as latent charge, generation after generation, never told, never asked, only counted. Manara came to the same truth from above and from the opposite instinct. Looking through witch sight into the planetary anatomy, he saw the elegance of it with grim, unwilling admiration. The builders of the pyrocrypt had not merely buried a calculus engine beneath a convenient hive world. They had designed the entire world as its shell and battery, urban concentration, devotional architecture, transit vectors, burial customs. Even the old archive bloodlines had all served the same vast dormant mechanism. It was magnificent in the way a perfect poison might be magnificent. Elegant, unforgivable, and over all of it rolled Malachar voice. The Dark Apostle seized the Voxnet again and again, his sermons overriding distress calls, battlefield frequencies, and the final prayers of a world that no longer had time for either command or absolution. His voice boomed across burning plazas and underhive sump corridors, through noble panic chambers and refugee trenches, while the screams of the dying rose beneath it like a congregation. A city is only honest when it burns. A soul is only honest when it begs. The words spread through the hives like fresh ignition. Cultists shrieked in ecstasy. The desperate wept. Some loyal soldiers fired their last magazines upward at the sermon towers broadcasting the Apostles' Creed, as though bullets could silence a voice, already rooted in the world's own unraveling. Then Varax moved, not with bombardment tremor, not with the collapse of one more shell-struck district. The entire central hive lurched, as if something titanic beneath it had turned in sleep. Walls split from foundation to vaulting. Habtiers slid against one another in grinding catastrophe. Cathedral buttresses snapped. Processional avenues yawned open. Men, tanks, shrines, guns, refugees, demons, and rubble all dropped together into suddenly appearing depths, while the roar of tearing stone drowned even the artillery. At the heart of the central hive, the earth opened. A vast descending shaft was revealed beneath the cracked basilical foundations, lined not in any imperial style, but in blackened script and ancient Prosperan symbols, scorched into the stone by fire that had burned without light. Cold air roared upward from the depths, carrying ash, old secrets, and the promise of something buried so long that the world above had forgotten it was only ever its lid. The newly opened abyss beneath the central hive did not remain secret for even the span of a prayer. What had lain hidden for centuries beneath basilical stone and processional bedrock now yawned open to the war above like a wound cut through the world's mask. Smoke and ash poured into it. Firelight from the burning districts far overhead bled down the shaft walls in broken red bands, mingling with the colder blue-gold pulses of sorcery and the guttering black-hearted flames now common across doomed Varax. Men, debris, shell casings, fragments of saints, and the odd tumbling corpse still fell at intervals through the opening, vanishing into the depths below before the sound of impact returned, if it returned at all. Both legions went for it at once. Above, the surface war did not end. It simply ceased to matter to those powers now racing downward. Cult armies still butchered refugees in the avenues and drove chained masses toward pits. Thousand Suns kill teams still burned their way through remaining strongpoints with precise, joyless fire. Loyalist holdouts still died in scattered bastions and mag-rail trenches, making the old sign of the Aquila with bloodied hands before chain-axe or warp fire silenced them. Demons still prowled the breach zones. Cathedral guns still thundered when corrupted crews or dying machine spirits found targets. But the great attention of the invaders had shifted. The world above was becoming background slaughter, a continuous sacrificial howl receding behind the imperative below. Menkaura Setep descended first by geometry. His forces moved with the same terrible discipline they had shown from the moment of their arrival. But here, beneath the hive and beyond the conventional architecture of war, that discipline took on an even stranger aspect. Rubriki marched in ordered files down black stairs too narrow for their broad shoulders, never once touching the walls, never once misplacing a foot despite the dust, the rubble, and the fresh blood running in little dark streams from the fighting above. Scarab occult terminators advanced before and behind, warding the column with inferno weapons held at exact angles. Sorcerers walked between the dead-filled suits, chanting old Prosperine sequence cants under their breath, opening locks not by force but by remembered theorem. Runes cut into the shaft walls glimmered in answer to their passing. Glyph chains dormant for ages woke and turned slow circles in the air, like invisible cogs now given light to cast. The word-bearers came down behind them by profanation. Where the 1,000 Suns read, the 17th broke. Where Menkaura's covens deciphered ward runes and coaxed open mnemonic thresholds, Malachar's apostles and diabolists answered resistant mechanisms with blood. Captives were dragged to the lip of sealed arches and slaughtered there in arterial sheets. Possessed shock troops were driven bodily into suspect, passages to trigger hidden trap systems, their warped bodies bursting apart in blue or crimson detonations as ancient defenses awoke and spent themselves. When a threshold demanded a name forgotten by history, a word-bearer priest cut his own tongue loose and fed it into the lock while chanting an inversion of the rite. When a hall refused to admit the impure, cultists were nailed alive to its lintels until their dying spasms smeared the required sigils across the stone. Between those opposed descents moved Halbrecht Vane, not by choice, but as a scrap of contested scripture. He had not gone far from the cracked ossuary stair before Menkaura's hunters found him again. Nor had the 1,000 Suns held him long before a word-bearer ambush in the lower shaftworks tore through the escort and dragged him into another corridor slick with fresh blood and old ash. Then the Sons of Prospero struck back 2 vaults later, and once more he changed hands amid close slaughter. By the time both factions reached the deeper levels, Halbrecht no longer had any coherent sense of belonging even to his own terror. He was hauled by the arm, thrown, forced to stumble, yanked upright, questioned, struck, dragged onward. Everyone wanted the same thing from him. Not his loyalty, not confession, fragments, mnemonic residues, bloodline recollections he had not known he possessed until all these post-human predators began clawing at them. The lower vaults unfolded around them, like the memory of a civilization that had hidden itself beneath religion and then waited too long to be found. They were not catacombs in any imperial sense, not merely tombways and reliquary crypts. Vast halls opened under the hive foundations, their ceilings lost in darkness, traversed by brass trackways and hanging crystal arrays. Psi-reactive libraries lay sealed behind doors without hinges, each panel inscribed with layered script that changed when observed from a different angle. Great machines sat, half buried in black dust, their forms somewhere between data engines, astrolabes, and sacrificial altars, all wired into the stone by bundles of metal and bone that had become indistinguishable over time. Ancient fires had burned here once, perhaps many times, yet they had never consumed their fuel. Halbrecht saw stacks of parchment and skin scroll blackened but intact, shelves scarred by flame that remained perfectly preserved, and hollows in the walls where soot lay in shapes resembling frozen hands reaching outward from within the stone. In one chamber, the floors were glassy from some ancient heat, and beneath that glass rested books, thousands upon thousands of them, visible as warped shadows under a transparent seal. In another, floating script engines turned in silence over a central dais, casting no light but displacing it, leaving strange absences in the air where illumination should have been. Elsewhere stood ranks of sealed memory coffers made from dark alloy and the polished vertebrae of some impossible beast. Every surface carried the taint of design. Nothing had been accidental here. Not the shelves, not the locks, not the fire scars, not the echoing geometry that made a whisper in one corridor speak back 3 halls away in a different voice. Manara moved through it with a growing stillness that was almost reverence. His coven solved locks that would have stalled any other invader for lifetimes. One gate of polished black stone opened only when 6 ward runes were sounded in the correct harmonic relation rather than touched, and Manara himself gave the sequence with calm precision while the air shivered around the note. A memory wall beyond that responded only to a line of old Prosperine encoded in contradictory syntax. Iset Kaur solved it in 3 attempts, though Menkara's sidelong glance made clear the younger sorcerer's first answer had been deliberately reckless. Mnemonic locks that required a family recollection hidden in a phrase of piety were forced from Halbrecht in gasped fragments, and the 1,000 Suns bound those fragments into sharper formulae until the vault itself admitted them. The word-bearers left their own trail through the underworld. Where the 1,000 Suns opened one gate cleanly, the 17th found another and marked it with flayed skins. Blood trails led into side chambers where cult sacrifices had bought entry to places otherwise warded against intrusion. Possessed dead lay jammed into trap mouths, their mangled remains used as wedges to keep ancient mechanisms from resetting. One long colonnade that had rejected all sorcerous intrusion now stood open, because Sabran the Diabolist had fed a chained choir of captives into the threshold gears until the mechanism clogged on bone and gristle. The floors there were slick with rendered fat and teeth. Neither method was enough. The first Guardian construct woke beneath the hall of sealed recollection. At first, Halbrecht thought the shadow at the far end of the hall was only another statue, some ancient sentinel figure worked in black metal and dust stone. Then the thing opened eyes, not like lenses, but like thoughts given light. The air around it tensed. Its body unfolded from the wall in too many joints, half machine and half the shape of a concept forced into armor. Brass ribs enclosed a void full of moving script. Its arms ended in blades one moment, in grasping arrays the next. When it stepped, memory itself seemed to distort around its feet. Men forgot for the span of a heartbeat why they were raising weapons. Then the construct came among them. A rubricae took the first blow. The Guardian touched its breastplate with an extending lattice of light, and the ancient armor burst outward into cobalt shards and a geyser of grey ash. The dead thing within had no voice with which to scream. A cultist charging from the other side was caught by a limb that became a wire cage around his head and shoulders, and in the time it took him to blink, he was stripped to a wet red framework of ribs and steaming organs. Another construct woke from the opposite wall, then another from the vault ceiling. Ancient defense systems flared alive all through the chamber sequence beyond. Thought-bound engines, machine revenants, architectures of murder built to preserve the pyrocrypt from precisely such intrusions. They slaughtered everything. Possessed were sliced into gobbets of mutating flesh. 1,000 Sun sorcerers were atomized into sprays of burning dust when their wards failed by a hair's breadth. Rubricae blew apart under contact fields that unstitched matter and meaning together. Word-bearer legionaries, for all their old gene-wrought resilience, were cut open from groin to jaw by limbs that seemed to know exactly where armor ended and life began. Halbrecht saw one guardian pass through a wall and emerge from the floor behind a scarab occult terminator, its hands becoming a halo of knives that sheared backpack, helm, spine, and one arm from the massive warrior in a single whirling motion. For a brief and astonishing span, both invading legions were driven backward. Menkora withdrew to a shattered threshold, half veiled in dust, warding Halbrecht behind a ring of surviving rubricae, while his mind raced through the logic of the construct patterns. Across the chamber, Malachar Vol stood amid the butchered remains of his own advance parties, Crozius planted in a mound of dead cultists and severed limbs, helmed face uplifted toward the still-moving guardians with something like delighted hatred. The next exchange between them was not by Vox. It was spoken across a hall of carnage, through the smoke of burned flesh and the drifting ash of the newly destroyed dead. "You break what you cannot read," Menkara said, his voice carrying with cold contempt. "And now the mechanism answers you with the only language you deserve." Malachar's reply came with a smile audible, beneath the grill of his helm. "And you read what you cannot own, sorcerer, and call the trespass wisdom. Yet here we stand equally unwelcome." A guardian lunged through the dead between them, and both struck it in the same heartbeat. Menkara's force poured blue fire through its script cage core, while Malachar's Crozius smashed one articulated limb aside in a burst of brass and black sparks. The construct reeled. "We require passage," Menkara said. "We require revelation," Malachar answered. "Passage will suffice for a moment. Then hear reason while your scripture catches breath. The inner chambers will butcher us piecemeal if we continue divided." Malachar laughed once, low and ugly. "I had wondered whether the sons of Magnus were still capable of confession. It is not confession, it is arithmetic. Call it what helps you kneel to your pride." Yet he signaled, and his legionaries checked their fire. Menkora did the same. A truce followed, brief and poisonous as a serpent coiled in a man's mouth. Together, they broke the guardian halls. Menkara's sorcerers identified the thought loops, anchoring the constructs to their dormant states, and disrupted them with disciplined bursts of witch force. The word-bearers hurled sacrificial bodies into the resulting openings, clogging the recovery patterns with blood and shattered flesh. Rubricae held advancing lines against flensing blades, while possessed absorbed trap discharges long enough for scarab occult terminators to close and sever power nodes buried behind brass spinal arrays. Malachar and Menkara, never once ceasing to hate one another, struck at the same targets from opposite philosophies, one with the logic of old Prospero, the other with savage certainty that all locks eventually yielded to sufficient pain. Behind them, Halbrecht stumbled through a hell of screaming machines and dead men, dragged now by one force, now by the other, kept alive only because neither lord could yet afford his death. At last they came to the final ward. It was a circular gate of black metal veined in gold, set into a wall of soot-scarred stone, every inch covered in symbols half Prosperine, half some older and more terrible notation. It did not open by blood alone, nor by thought alone. It demanded convergence. Mnemonic fragments from Halbrecht's bloodline, sorcerous harmonic from Menkara, sacrificial pressure from Malachar's right, all of it together. The moment the last lock disengaged, both sides betrayed the truce. A word-bearer legionary drove a chainblade into the back of a rubricae. At the same instant, a scarab occult terminator decapitated a cult priest beside him. Bolters fired point blank. Force staves crashed against Crozius hafts. Chain axes shrieked over gilded plate. Menkora flung a killing hex toward Malachar, while the Dark Apostle answered with a sermon-born blast of warp pressure that sent cracked teeth and blood spraying from the mouths of lesser men in the chamber. The vault entrance became an abattoir so close and dense that long-range fire meant nothing. Giants hammered at one another chest to chest, helm to helm, their voices reduced to snarls, curses, invocations, clipped commands. A word-bearer was driven face first into the gate, teeth first, and kept there while 1,000 Suns' blade punched through the back of his neck. A scarab occult terminator lost one arm to a chain axe and answered by headbutting his attacker hard enough to burst the word-bearer's face into gore and helmet fragments. Broken teeth skittered across the floor. Burning ceramites smoked in the air. Blood hissed where it struck sorcerous heat. Halbrecht was thrown sideways by the crush and slid across stone slick with marrow and oil and blood. He struck the half-open gate, rolled through its widening mouth, and for one impossible heartbeat found silence beyond the slaughter. Then he saw it. The blasphemous fire hung in the vastness, beyond the threshold like a suspended sun. It did not rest on any brazier or altar. It was held in space by geometries of gold, ash, and script rotating around it in impossible slow majesty. Rings within rings, theorem and sacrilege interlocked. Its light was not one colour, but many at war with each other. Gold like old crowns and execution halos, red like opened arteries, blue like witch flame on dead skin. At its heart burned something deeper, a hunger-coloured dark around which all brightness bent. Faces moved within it, not consumed, not preserved, but screaming as part of the fire's own shifting body. Some were human, some were not. Some looked almost serene until the flame turned and showed them from another angle, and then their mouths were open in eternal agony again. The chamber around it was vast enough to shame cathedrals. Black walls vanished upward and downward beyond sight. Ancient script crawled over every surface, burning and reforming. The air itself trembled, with pressure, with meaning, with a power so old and buried that the whole war above now seemed merely the scratching of vermin on a sealed tomb. Behind Halbrecht, the close quarters murder at the threshold still raged. Before him, bound in those impossible rotating cages of gold and ash and screaming fire, waited the thing for which a world had been lied to, bled, and opened. The first lie Halbrecht had told himself about the thing bound in the heart of Varax was that it was a fire. Fire, even at its most murderous, still belonged to known principles. It consumed fuel. It cast light. It obeyed the old covenant of matter and heat. This thing merely borrowed the language of flame because no lesser image could contain the insult of it. It hung in the vastness beyond the breached gate, as if the vault itself had grown a heart, and that heart had learned blasphemy. Gold geometries circled it in impossible silence. Ash spirals rose and fell without settling. Faces moved in its depths, not merely trapped there, but rendered into part of its burning theorem. Their mouths forever open in prayer, in revelation, in terror, in all three made indistinguishable. The battle at the threshold faltered without truly ending. Even Astartes knew at times to look upon a thing before they resumed the killing. Word-bearers and Thousand Sons alike stood amid their dead and their fresh blood, helms tilted toward the suspended abomination. The chamber throbbed with it. Not heat, meaning, promise, threat. Every pulse of the blasphemous fire seemed to strike the nerves rather than the flesh, plucking secret hungers into speech without once using a human tongue. To the word-bearers, it spoke as revelation. Halbrecht saw the change pass through them with dreadful clarity. Their postures altered first. The hard butcher's readiness of the corridor melee softened into something more devout and more dangerous. Legionaries who had moments before been sawing at one another with chain blades now lowered their weapons a fraction as the fire's light crawled over the burning book icons on their armor and made the scripture carved there seem fresh-cut and wet. Cult priests at the rear began to weep through blood-smeared grins. Sabran's acolytes dropped to their knees and pressed their foreheads into the gore-slick stone. Even the possessed, twitching and snarling as though every sinew ached for violence, went briefly still beneath the relic's gaze. Halbrecht could not hear what they heard, but he saw it in their faces. Not command, invitation. The fire whispered to them that pain was a grammar more honest than speech, that worlds could be converted not by argument, but by agony so vast it broke resistance into ecstasy. It promised a liturgy of flame under which cities would strip themselves naked of pretense and kneel willingly at the edge of their own extermination. The word-bearers looked upon that promise and found in it not horror, but vindication. Everything they had done to Varax, every hanging, every pit, every sermon shouted over machine gun fire and open throats, seemed reflected back at them as sacred proof. Malachar Vol lowered his Crozius and stepped forward through the dead. His armor smoked from the threshold slaughter. Blood, some his, most not, ran down the haft of his weapon and dripped from the parchment strips hanging at his waist. He was a ruinous priest, walking toward a shrine he had dreamed of before knowing its name. When he came within the first circle of gold geometry, he stopped, and without hesitation or shame, he went to one knee. Not in fear, not in submission, in adoration. Truth need not be mastered to be obeyed, he said, and his voice rolled through the vault, as if the chamber had always been waiting to hear those words spoken aloud. The fire brightened in answer, or seemed to. It was impossible to know whether it had actually changed, or whether every witness had merely been made more susceptible to its meaning. To the thousand suns, it spoke as theorem. Menkara Setep stared into it with a stillness that bordered on violence. He did not see a god. He did not hear revelation in the barking cadence of the 17th. What the fire showed him was worse, because it was beautiful to exactly the degree that made it unforgivable. Layers of mutable equation turned within its burning body. Matter, soul pressure, causality, memory, all expressed not as static laws, but as a fluid architecture that could be revised by sufficient will and sufficient understanding. Halbrecht saw Menkara's eyes narrow not in worship, but in hunger, sharpened by intellect. The exalted sorcerer looked upon the blasphemous fire and saw a calculus engine so profound that flesh itself might be rewritten, fate bent and refactored, the old humiliations of his legion perhaps one day answered in a language stronger than lament. The sons of Prospero formed around him by instinct and old discipline. Scarab occult terminators took station. Surviving rubricae locked into precise angles. Sorcerers began to murmur measured sequence counts, each syllable placed with mathematical care. Menkora lifted his staff and inscribed layered hexagrammic control patterns in the air before him, line over line of glowing signs interlocking around the fire's outer geometry. He did not rush. That was the difference between him and those kneeling in ecstasy across the chamber. He sought purchase. For a moment it seemed he found it. The gold rings slowed. The ash spirals altered their cadence. One of the screaming faces suspended in the inner blaze flattened, stretched, and became briefly legible as script. Menkara extended one hand, fingers spread, every motion exact. Then the fire retaliated. It did not strike his body, it opened futures. Halbrecht saw the change by the way Menkara recoiled without moving. The sorcerer's expression, so long composed in cold hauteur, cracked, not with panic, with pain of a subtler and far deeper breed. The relic poured visions through him, endless ranks of rubricae standing under dead stars, while the names of the men they had once been faded from all memory. Dust spilling from broken suits onto nameless worlds. Battlefields, where the thousand suns won and still remained damned. Halls of Prospero remembered by no living tongue. Brothers unmourned, because there would be none left capable of mourning. The whole legion reduced not merely to extinction, but to erasure. Menkara hissed through his teeth. Blood leaked from one eye and then the other in thin, dark streams. His control patterns wavered. Isetkur chose that instant. Halbrecht had seen ambition in him before, but here beneath the relic's changing light, it became naked. The younger sorcerer moved not against the fire, but with its reflected geometry. He shifted one pace to the side, where a band of gold radiance cut across the floor like a blade laid flat, raised his staff, and cast through the reflection rather than directly. It was a clever strike. Menkora's own control lattice turned inward for the heartbeat required, killing force disguised inside the logic of reinforcement. The blow would have speared through his master's back and into the core of his heart. The fire noticed. The reflected band rose, not as light, as will. It struck Iset Kor across the face and side with a shriek of inverted brightness. Flesh blackened instantly, one half of his features charred to the bone, skin peeling back in curled strips, while one eye burst wetly in its socket. He screamed and staggered, hands clawing at his own ruin. But the greater punishment came not to the flesh. It came to what the light cast. His shadow tore itself loose from the floor. It rose behind him, thin at first, and then thickening like smoke learning anatomy. The shape retained his outline, only long enough to make the wrongness intimate. Then it grew extra joints, a neck too, long by half, fingers like hooked quills, and a mouth where no mouth should have been. It clung to the ground and to the wall at once, writhing with a private hunger, while its half-made face turned toward Iset with murderous familiarity. The sorcerer spun, half-blind and shrieking, lashing at it with witch fire that passed through and yet somehow fed it. Menkara did not turn to help him. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he chose not to. Across the chamber, Sabran the Diabolist saw the relic's answering fury and mistook it for invitation. He cast off what remained of caution and opened himself to possession with ceremonial exuberance. A captive demon, long prepared for this moment in brass chains and script-bound wounds, was dragged howling to him by his acolytes. Sabran split his own breastplate with a ritual blade, opening old scar tissue and newer battle wounds alike, and forced the creature into the cavity beneath his ribs while chanting praise through clenched teeth. The demon entered him like a hooked spear, driven through meat. He convulsed. Armor seams bulged. His spine arched so hard that vertebrae cracked audibly. Muscles swelled under the plate, then tore through it in red-black knots. Horns of calcified fire burst from one shoulder. One arm lengthened grotesquely, gauntlet and flesh fusing into a clawed shape slick with black burning blood. His mouth opened too wide. Smoke and a childlike laughter not his own spilled from it. When Sabran rose again, he was larger, stronger, and already dying in a dozen hidden ways. Black fire leaked from the tears in his skin, yet his eyes shone with ghastly triumph as he faced the relic. "I hear you," he croaked. "I hear the true tongue beneath the pyres." Above them, the surface war worsened beyond the last boundaries of sanity. Firestorms raced along hive bridges under hurricane winds, born of heat and sorcery. Refugees trapped on the suspended spans between spires chose the long drop rather than the demons coming behind them, hurling themselves into the ash-dark gulf with robes and limbs streaming out like torn banners. Habstacks burst from within as pyromantic pressure met sabotaged gas lines and demonic infestation. Whole towers became furnaces packed with meat, windows vomiting sheets of fire and human silhouettes in their final convulsions. Processional avenues vanished under tides of smoke, through which only muzzle flash, witchlight, and the red eyes of hunting things remained visible. The screams of Varax had become so constant that the absence of screaming in any given place now marked only the presence of death completed. The relic answered all of it. Halbrecht felt that with nauseating certainty, when the gold geometry nearest him shifted and aligned not to Menkara's patterns, nor to Sabran's ecstatic corruption, but to his blood. He froze. The circles of light rotated until they framed him. Not his body alone. Something older in him. His lineage. The hidden custodianship buried through generations of archivists who had lied, copied false maps, sealed records, and guarded what none of them had fully understood. He felt the recognition pass through the vault like a hand running down a chain, long concealed in stone. Memories not his own stirred at the edge of thought. Voices of dead clerics whispering root phrases to sons and nephews by candlelight. Seal rings pressed into pale palms. Oaths made over blank pages. None of them had known the true origin of the pyrocrypt. They had only inherited its concealment as duty. But the relic knew. It reached for him not as prey, not even as witness, but as interface. Halbrecht fell to his knees with a cry as the dormant fragments in his bloodline awakened. Pathways blazed in his mind, doors beneath doors, sequences of movement through the lower libraries, custodial litanies that were never devotional at all, but mnemonic locks disguised as prayer. Menkora turned at last, seeing the change. Malachar rose from his own kneeling adoration with predatory interest. In that instant, both monsters understood the same thing. Halbrecht Vane was no longer merely a scholar with stolen maps. He was the living key. The relic's light deepened around him. The innermost faces in the fire opened their mouths wider and wider, until their screams became a pressure too low for ears, and too immense for the bones to ignore. The gold geometries began to twist, not rotating around a fixed center any longer, but folding through one another like rings in a dimension the chamber was not meant to contain. Reality around the vault began to invert. Stone surfaces bowed inward and outward in alternating pulses. Distances lost their loyalty. A column at the chamber's edge seemed half a mile away, then near enough to touch. Rubricae standing in ordered lines appeared reflected inside one another's armor, as though the dead were now marching through nested versions of the same moment. Word-bearers found their own shadows lagging a second behind their movements, then racing ahead. Blood spilled across the floor in defiance of slope, running uphill toward the relic. The air thickened. Sound bent. A cult acolyte screamed when he saw his own hand from the wrong side and hacked it off at the wrist to stop whatever impossible perspective had seized him. Then the planet's core answered. The sound came up through every layer of Varax, from mantle and bedrock, and buried chambers older than the Imperium's first lies. It was not an explosion, not a quake in the ordinary sense. It was a howl drawn out over continental depth, so vast and slow that it seemed at first like a change in pressure rather than a sound. The whole vault trembled in sympathy. Dust rose from the black stone. Ancient script burned brighter and then darker. Far above, across all 9 hives, foundations cracked anew as the world below them gave voice. The blasphemous fire brightened at the heart of that howl, and every soul in the chamber understood in his own way that the thing bound beneath Varax was no longer merely being sought. It was waking. The chamber of the blasphemous fire ceased to resemble a place and became instead a contest of imposed meaning. Its black walls still stood. Its impossible vaulting still vanished upward into dark shot through with gold geometry and drifting ash. Blood still pooled between the dead and the dying where word-bearers and thousand suns had butchered one another at the threshold. Yet all of that had become secondary to the pressure now gathering around the bound flame. The relic no longer merely burned. It selected. It answered. It invited contradiction and fed on it. Every pulse that moved through its screaming heart seemed to ask the same silent question in a different tongue. What shape shall damnation take? Menkora Setep gave his answer first. He stepped through the red fog of the vault with his face pale from the fires, retaliation and blood dried in dark lines beneath both eyes. Yet the discipline of him had not broken. If anything, pain had refined him. He lifted his staff and drove its ferruled butt against the black stone. The sound cracked through the chamber like a decree. At once, the surviving Rubricae moved. They did not scramble. They did not hurry. They took station with the grave exactitude of funerary pieces being set back into their proper pattern after some crude mortal hand had displaced them. One by one, then in mirrored files, the dead-bound legionaries arranged themselves around the relic at measured intervals, each suit of cobalt and gold becoming a silent runic anchor. Scarab occult terminators stood at cardinal points, broad shoulders turned toward the likely vectors of assault, inferno weapons lowered but not idle. The surviving sorcerers of Menkare's cabal formed a second ring between those dead guardians, their staffs raised, lips already moving through the first. Sequence phrases of a rite older than the Imperium that now sat blasphemously above it all, like a rotting crown. Halbrecht Vane watched from the edge of a fractured threshold alcove, his breath shallow and trembling, while the air took on the feel of invisible machinery locking into alignment. What Manara built was not prayer, it was structure. Hexagrammic control patterns unfolded in the air in nested layers, each line of light precise enough to wound the eye if stared at too long. Angles met and separated. Script formed and was immediately consumed by the next line of logic. Flame and geometry braided together around the blasphemous fire until the great suspended abomination seemed increasingly constrained by a lattice of disciplined psychic force. The sorcerers chanted in exact sequence, never speaking over one another, never yielding cadence to emotion. Each phrase struck the next like a cogtooth meeting its proper mate. Manara moved among them as conductor and executioner both, correcting inflection with a glance, sharpening a wavering rune with one cut of his free hand, driving the ritual forward by intellect alone. To look upon it was to understand the terrifying virtue of the Thousand Suns. Their arrogance was not disordered. Their cruelty was not ecstatic. It was cold enough to be beautiful. They believed utterly that sufficient knowledge could place even the warp itself beneath a measured hand. Across the chamber, Malachar Vol made answer by giving the world to frenzy. The apostle rose from his devout kneel before the relic and opened his arms as though embracing the screams locked within it. His armor was drenched in blood and ritual smoke. His crozius burned at the mace head with a deep arterial glow. Behind him gathered the surviving word-bearers, black-red and crimson, their helms scarred, their pauldrons sticky with the gore of the threshold massacre, their scripture strips fluttering in the pressure, blowing through the chamber from far above. He did not arrange them into equations. He made of them a congregation. The Vox relays captured in the underworks screamed to life one after another, their signal carried upward through shrine shafts, maintenance trunks, choir ducts, and the old hidden communication arteries once used by the sealed custodians of the pyrocrypt. Malachar's voice rose through every one of them, not only within the vault, but into the dying hive above, into the next hive, and then the next, and then across the entire planetary network, wherever machine spirit, copper line, or stolen demon would still bear him. The command was immediate and absolute. Across Varax, billions were forced into synchronized prayer and self-mutilation. In hab blocks stacked from floor to smoke-black ceiling, men knelt shoulder to shoulder while cult enforcers strode the aisles with hooked knives, carving confession marks into cheeks, chests, forearms, and tongues whenever the responses faltered. In the pilgrim fields, those not yet dead were made to open their own flesh before the icon towers, blood pouring into trenches cut in geometric channels around the pyres. In manufactorum ruins, labour gangs beat their foreheads against broken conveyor housings until the metal ran slick with blood and grey matter, each impact timed to the blasphemous litanies booming from the sermon towers. Underhive congregations gouged symbols into their own skin with rusted tools, while priests in hidden catechisms led them through call and response so vast and so rhythmic that the whole world seemed to pulse with it. It was not chaos. It was ecstatic order of another kind, brutal and convinced and utterly theological. Malachar turned the entire planet into one colossal act of sacrificial devotion. Halbrecht felt the difference between the rites as a pain behind the eyes. On one side, Manara's cold architecture of ash, theorem, and binding force. On the other, Malachar's red ocean of agony, worship, and willing desecration. They were perfect inverses, not simple opposites, but reflections of two great lies, spoken with equal confidence into the same abyss. Manara's voice cut through the rising pressure. The warp is not a god, it is a sea. Only fools kneel to tides. Malachar laughed, and his answer rolled upward through the chamber and outward into the hives like a second bombardment. And only greater fools believe they can drink the sea without drowning. The blasphemous fire swelled between them, thrilled by contradiction. The chamber did not remain still long enough for rhetoric to matter. The clash resumed almost immediately around the ritual lines, because neither legion could permit the other uninterrupted mastery, even while both were attempting it. Possessed elites hurled themselves at the Thousand Suns perimeter with slavering fervor, their bodies already half rewritten by Sabran's ongoing profanities. One came on all fours, like a great, skinless hound, back split open to reveal a spinal maw lined with grinding teeth. A scarab occult terminator met it with a power blade thrust through the chest. The blade went in clean, but the thing's transformed ribs locked around the weapon and held it there long enough for another possessed to leap onto the Terminator's back and hammer talons through rear plating in a spray of sparks, ceramite fragments, and boiling organ matter. The Terminator answered by igniting warp fire from his own gauntlet directly into the creature clinging to him. Blue flame filled its open mouth. Its skull burst from within, showering the ritual floor with teeth, burnt tongue, and clots of black blood. Elsewhere, chain teeth locked in bone. A word-bearer champion drove his chainsword through the side of a rubricae and hit the dense, ash-bound mass within. The weapon snarled and jammed there, throwing oily smoke and grey dust into his face. Before he could wrench it free, a force stave slammed across his helm and crushed one side of it inward. Eye, cheekbone, and teeth burst from the split in a red wash. He died gurgling with chain teeth still chewing uselessly inside the corpse suit he had tried to open. A possessed crashed shoulder first into one of Menkara's sorcerers and took them both down. It tore the sorcerer's lower jaw off with one hand and shoved its own face into the wound, vomiting writhing warp flame into the cavity where a voice had been. The sorcerer convulsed, skin blistering from the inside, then managed with his last coherent gesture to press 2 fingers against the possessed's breastbone and speak a single syllable of annihilating precision. Both bodies came apart together. Armor, flesh, demonic gristle, blood, and powdered marble blasted across the chamber in a wet ring. At the chamber's edges, Holbrecht crawled. He no longer moved like a sane man because sanity had become a luxury of distance. His hands shook constantly. His ears rang with overlapping sermons, sequence counts, demon laughter, and the trapped screaming from within the relic itself. Yet somewhere under the ruin of his mind, a hard and singular idea had taken root. Neither side could be permitted to claim the flame. Not the apostle with his gospel of agony, not the sorcerer with his arithmetic of domination. Survival no longer mattered. Loyalty had long since burned out of the question. Even victory, if one could use such a word beneath Varax, had become an obscenity. There remained only refusal. He understood the lower vault more clearly now that the relic had touched the bloodline beneath his skin. Roots unfolded in memory. Custodial falsehoods reversed themselves. He knew, in flashes and fragments, where the old reactor seals lay beneath the deepest vault, where the original engineers of the pyrocrypt had nested containment redundancies under layers of pious fraud and architectural deceit. If those seals were sabotaged, if the energy flows anchoring the lower chambers were allowed to rupture in full convergence with the rites now tearing at the relic, then Varax would not merely burn, it would die. So would he. So would untold millions who had no hand left in any choice. The knowledge sickened him. It also no longer offered alternatives. Halbrecht began to move through side passages, lit by alternating red and blue sorcerous glare, stepping over broken limbs, ducking beneath the swings of giants too intent on one another to notice a blood-drenched cleric slipping through the margins. He found the first access niche behind a collapsed script engine and opened it with a phrase his grandfather had whispered once over a candle flame, believing it to be only an archive blessing. Beneath the niche lay the old seal controls, brass black and hot to the touch. He tore the first linkage free with both hands and felt the entire floor shudder in answer. Above him, the rituals bit deeper into one another. Menkara's lattice achieved partial dominion. Rings of ordered ash rose from the blasphemous fire and began to orbit according to his theorem. each one etched in silent script and disciplined malice. Around those rings, the rubricae stood like dead kings, forced into one last impossible vigilance, their armor humming with the pressure flowing through them. For a heartbeat, perhaps two, it seemed the sorcerer might truly force the relic into coherence. At that same moment, Malachar's planetary liturgy reached a crescendo. Across the 9 hives, the synchronized prayer became self-slaughter. Men opened their flesh in unison. Cult blades flashed by the million. Blood ran in channels through plazas, hab corridors, prayer pits, trenchworks, shrine naves, and manufactorum gutters. The whole world cried out in one devotional spasm. That offering surged downward into the pyrocrypt like a second tide and struck Manara's ordered ash with the full weight of ecstatic human agony. The interference was immediate and catastrophic. Districts above vanished into cinder. One entire bridge city between the 3rd and 4th hives simply became ash on the wind, its millions reduced in the span of a heartbeat to grey particulate drifting through the firestorm as though they had never possessed flesh. Elsewhere, the opposite horror occurred. In the underhives beneath the 7th spire, crowds caught between the converging rites did not burn away at all. They fused. Men became statues of glass, brass, and living bone, limbs locked together in the final poses of supplication or flight, mouths still moving soundlessly inside transparent faces, while brass-veined skeletons showed through the vitrified meat. Entire hab galleries froze that way, impossible galleries of still screaming devotion. In the vault itself, the backlash tore through both legions. One ring of Manara's ash geometry shattered and flensed a pair of sorcerers to skeletons in an instant, their flesh blown off in a spiral of grey dust and wet red ribbons. Simultaneously, a blood flame surge from Malachar's right lashed outward and hit a knot of word-bearers, fusing armor to skin and skin to bone until they dropped howling as one red-black mass that still tried to crawl toward the relic in worship. Halbrecht reached the second seal chamber on his hands and knees. The access corridor had begun to warp around him, perspectives lengthening and collapsing with each pulse from the increasingly unstable fire. He found the reactor control spindle by memory and bloodline instinct, jammed a broken ritual blade into the venting seam, and levered until the housing cracked. Superheated steam and black sparks burst out, searing the side of his face and cooking the skin off 2 fingers. He screamed, dropped, and then forced himself back to the task with what remained of those hands. He thought not of salvation. There was none. He thought only of denial. No altar, no theorem, no holy flame possessed by monsters, speaking certainty in different tones. Back in the main chamber, Manara and Malachar understood at the same terrible instant that the relic would not tolerate singular mastery. They looked into its core and saw it changing. The blasphemous fire drew in upon itself, faces stretching and dissolving, gold geometries grinding against one another with the sound of cathedral bells crushed inside a tomb. Its heart swelled dark, then split along a line no eye could properly follow. One manifestation emerged as ordered ash. It burned pale and cold, a suspended solar wound made from script, dust, memory, and precise annihilation. Within it flickered the outlines of runes and dead stars, and around it circled the geometry Manara had nearly imposed, now half-born as its own distinct appetite. The other emerged as devotional blood flame. It pulsed wet crimson and furnace gold, every flare accompanied by the impression of distant chanting, opened throats, and ecstatic collapse. Faces formed in it more readily and suffered more visibly, mouths wide in worship or terror, or the final instant where those states became the same thing. Around it coiled the sacrificial pressure Malachar had fed from the world above, transformed into a living gospel of pain. For one impossible breath, the twin manifestations hung side by side, each complete enough to be separate, each incomplete enough to hunger for the rest. Then both began to descend, not upward toward the warring legions, not outward into the chamber, downward, toward the planetary core. Manara felt the motion, and his expression hardened into a kind of grief sharpened into command. Malachar saw it and smiled with the hideous serenity of a prophet receiving confirmation from a murder scene. Around them, the vault shook harder. Deep below, reactor seals failed one by one under Halbrecht's unseen sabotage, and Varax groaned like a beast beginning to understand the knife already buried in its heart. The fire had become two truths at war with one another, and both were falling deeper into the world. Varax had screamed before. It had screamed in the voices of pilgrims trampled into devotional stone, in the shriek of void stations venting atmosphere, and men into hard black, in the roar of collapsing habstacks, and the wet hacking cries of the disemboweled learning at last, that lungs could drown in their own blood. Those had been the sounds of a world under assault. What came now was the sound of a world dying. The great hive plates shifted against one another, with a violence older than war. Continents groaned. Fault lines that had slept beneath shrines and manufactoria and pilgrim roads for uncounted generations split wide under the pressure of rites, sabotage, and waking fire. Cathedral foundations buckled as if some unseen hand had taken hold of their roots and twisted. Entire basilical naves folded inward, flinging statues, bells, priests, and gun crews into chasms opening beneath the sanctified floors. Magma vents burst up through crypts and martyr chapels in lances of red-white ruin, punching through mosaics of saints and turning reliquaries into bubbling slag. Across miles of broken district and ash plain, the crust of Varax cracked open in lines so long that the eye lost them in smoke and distance. Warp light poured from those wounds in slow, polluted rivers, a bruise-colored radiance threaded with blue, black, and blood-red fire. The city no longer burned above the world. The world burned through the city. In orbit, the war had become the dance of wreckage around an execution. The surviving fleets of the Word-bearers and the Thousand Suns still tore at one another through belts of debris and burning hulks, their captains too damned or too disciplined to yield even with the planet below tearing itself open. Strike cruisers limped on one flank, atmosphere jetting from wounds in long silver streams, while sorceress escorts from Prospero's bloodline slid through the smoke of dying engines and fired lance strikes into exposed gun decks. Battle barges of the 17th answered with mass barrages that turned already crippled vessels into expanding flowers of molten iron and spinning corpses. Boarding torpedoes still crossed the void through clouds of frozen blood and shattered plating. Vox traffic between ships had become almost useless. Liturgy drowned one channel. Sorceress static strangled the next. Distress calls howled into sermons, and then vanished in machine spirit gibbering. Through it all, the wreckage of Varax's old orbital ring fell in slow, burning arcs, a halo of dead steel around a world coming apart. Deep below that dying sky, Manara Setep drove downward. He had no illusion left that Varax could be preserved. The sabotage in the lower reactors, the split relic, the interference of Malachar's vast devotional butchery, and the deeper answer of the buried fire had already pushed the world past reprieve. The ash aspect of the blasphemous fire was descending toward the core, falling into catastrophe with the patient certainty of an equation solving itself through annihilation. Manara would not let it be lost. If Varax must die, then he would salvage meaning from its death. The theorem would not vanish into molten ruin and screaming devotion. He would seize what could be seized, bind what could be bound, and from the wreckage perhaps redeem one shard of purpose from 10,000 years of ash and shame. His surviving forces advanced through lower passages, now more wound than architecture. Rubricae marched in unbroken files across black stone bridges that cracked and shed fragments into bottomless light. Scarab occult terminators led the descent with inferno weapons and Kopesh blades ready, their every step measured even as the world shook around them. Sorcerers moved between those dead ranks, chanting containment sequences and pathfinding formulae while witchlight crawled over walls. Inscribed with blackened script and ancient Prosperine symbols. Manara himself walked at the center beneath a barrier of layered fire and sigil. That barrier existed because Iset Kur had at last chosen open cruelty over veiled ambition. The younger sorcerer's face was half-charred from the relic's earlier rebuke. Burned flesh clung black and red to one side of his skull, and the eye on that side had become a white, seared pearl. His shadow still moved wrong when the light struck it, lagging or turning with motions not his own. Yet pain had not blunted his hunger. It had refined it. When the lower vault passages began to collapse under heat stress and ritual distortion, Manara ordered a defensive halt in a chamber lined with thought-reactive brass pillars and ancient cinder pits. Iset's bodyguard thralls, mute and heavily warded, closed around their master while the coven sought a path through the instability. Then Iset moved, his staff flashed. The first thrall died. Without sound, throat opened from ear to ear in a clean arterial burst. The second took a force spike through the sternum and dropped twitching. Iset caught their spilling blood in a hexagrammic loop with one hand while speaking a rapid binding sequence through split lips. The remaining thralls tried to recoil. He killed them all in as many heartbeats, opening bellies, splitting chests, breaking necks with precise contempt, and fed every death into the widening pattern around Manara. Blue-white fire rose from the corpses and thickened into a barrier wall around the exalted sorcerer. It was elegant. It was vile. It worked. Manara watched it form without gratitude. He did not rebuke the method, because the necessity was plain. The Thousand Sons told themselves stories of knowledge as distinction, of control as moral separation from the slobbering devotions of the 17th. Yet here was truth enough for any historian of damnation. Ambition among the sons of Magnus was every bit as willing to cut throats and build power from warm entrails as any apostle's piety. The difference lay only in the grammar of the murder. Above and behind them, Malachar Vol embraced the dying of Varax as holy confirmation. His voice had long since become more than command. It was weather now, a pressure carried through every working vox, every corrupted loudhailer, every sermon tower still standing amid the burning hives. He ordered all remaining cults to continue their chants without pause. If tongues split, let them chant through blood. If lungs filled, let the words be coughed red into the ash. If men could no longer stand, let them kneel in their own opened guts and praise the truth of ruin until the last beat failed in their throats. Planetary damnation was no longer a risk or a tactic. It was proof. The world had accepted the sermon and now died to ratify it. Everywhere on the surface and in the upper underworks, chained congregations obeyed. Men beat their own breasts, roar in collapsed shrines while the floors broke beneath them. Pilgrims in the ash fields clawed liturgical symbols into their skin and then into the skin of the dead when their own hands grew too weak. Cult militias shouted responses over the thunder of falling masonry. Wounded men whose lungs were already full of blood still forced blasphemies through bubbling lips because the guns behind them would punish silence and because terror itself had become devotion. Sabran the Diabolist gave Malachar more than chance. Somewhere between the lower vault approaches and the newly exposed descent toward the core, he opened a deliberate rift. The wound in reality did not take the shape of a gate. It spread like a tear in wet cloth, widening under the pressure of his demon-bloated will and the sacrificial force still flooding downward from the hives above. Blue fire ran along one edge of it. Red lightning gnawed at the other. Through that split came entities of changing allegiance and common hatred. Thin-limbed horrors with avian eyes and mouths full of shifting script. Horned brute things of undivided appetite dragging chains of sparks from the warp behind them. Shapes like animated cloaks full of knives. Crawling fire with too many faces. Their arrival transformed the approaches to the planetary heart into a battlefield no doctrine had truly prepared for, even among traitors. Mortal troops still fought there because mortals were always thrown where the dying ground was thickest. Traitor auxilia and surviving loyal holdouts, cult fanatics and desperate underhive scavengers all hacked and shot and burned one another amid the greater war of Astartes and demons. Rubricae advanced through packs of warp things and blasted them into whirling ash. Word-bearers bellowed scripture while driving chain blades into bodies not fully material. Men died beneath falling vault stones, under demon talons, inside witchfire, or simply because animate flame took the shape of a hand and reached inside their chests to squeeze. In that same infernal descent, Dreor Celt led the last great push of the 17th. He came through demon fire and raining masonry as he came through all things, without flourish and without pause. Whole slabs of black stone shattered on the passage around him. One struck a legionary at his side and pulped him flat enough to smear across the wall. Dreor did not look. His chain axe chewed through a twisting warp entity and then through the skull of 1,000 Suns thrall who had the misfortune to stand behind it. Blood, black ichor, and burning fragments of armor sprayed across his already filthy plate. He kept going. A Rubricae stepped into his path and fired point blank. The bolts burst across his chest and pauldron, ripping scripture strips away and opening 2 small but ugly wounds. Dreor answered by closing the distance, hooking the inferno gun aside with the haft of his axe and burying the revving teeth of the blade through helm, faceplate, and the dust-packed emptiness within. The corpse suit came apart in a gout of blue sparks and grey ash. He ripped the weapon free and moved on to the next target. There was something almost obscene in his constancy. All around him, Varax came unmade by theology, sorcery, reactor failure, demonic incursion, and waking deep fire. Dreor remained what he had always been, a killing implement applied to resistance. He slew with raw, workmanlike fury, never hurried, never distracted, as though the world's ending were merely another difficult job to be completed with proper care. Halbrecht Vane no longer moved by his own choosing at all. The sabotaged systems he had broken had begun to answer one another in hidden ways, and the converging ritual currents of the split relic had found him again through bloodline and ruin alike. He stumbled through lower passages, dragged by a pull no muscle could resist. At times he clawed at walls or cracked script pillars in his fingers, simply slipped free as though the stone itself wished him onward. At times he felt himself weightless for a heartbeat, carried through impossible angles while the world rotated around some center deeper than gravity. Men and monsters fought around him, but their blows often missed by inches without intending to, as if he had become a point already claimed by the older machinery of Varax's design. He was being drawn into the planetary heart because witness, once chosen, was not easily discarded. The descent ended in revelation. The core chamber of Varax was no mere vault and no simple cavern hollowed by forgotten industry. It was a colossal amphitheatre of black stone, vast enough to shame the cathedra above, and ancient enough to make those cathedra seem like a child's pious lies stacked over a grave. Tier upon tier of curved terraces descended in impossible symmetry around a central abyss. Bridges of soot-dark rock hung unsupported over that depth. Script crawled across every railing and buttress, some lines burning dull gold, some blacker than the stone beneath. Heat rolled up from below in breaths that smelled of old suns, fresh blood, and the electrical stink of the warp. At the bottom, where no floor should have been, there stretched a sea of impossible flame. It moved like liquid, and like thought, and like a congregation seen from too high above. Waves of red gold, blue-white, corpse-black, and ash-pale light rolled over one another without ever mixing cleanly. Faces rose in it, screamed, and sank. At moments the fire formed geometries like Manara's theorem, and at others it became all wound and appetite, a liturgical ocean seeking only a shore made of flesh. Circling above that sea, descending now toward it in widening arcs, were the relic's 2 separated aspects. The ordered ash turned with cold stellar dignity, rings of script and pale annihilation orbiting its core. The devotional blood flame moved in pulses and surges, every beat accompanied by the phantom echo of billions praying, begging, bleeding. They circled one another like predator stars, scenting the same kill. Manara emerged onto one of the inner terraces and saw the ash aspect falling toward the fire sea below. Malachar entered from the opposite side and beheld the blood flame with the gaze of a worshipper, meeting revelation in the shape of execution. Around them gathered the ruins of both their legions, surviving elite warriors, sorcerers, apostles, bodyguards, demons, cult remnants, and mortals so damned by circumstance that even their deaths now belonged to larger meanings. Halbrecht staggered onto a lower bridge between them and had no strength left even to pray against the sight. Then the omen came. Within the fire below, beneath the circling relic aspects and the impossible tides of living flame, shapes vast as ancestral terror began to move. No detail held. The eye could not properly keep them, yet every witness felt the scale of them. In the marrow, shoulders broader than memory, helmed or horned or winged suggestions of forms so immense that the mind reached instinctively for the oldest legends of transhuman greatness and betrayal. Not present, not manifest, more like reflections passing through a depth too great to measure. The implication alone was monstrous. It was as if the warp itself had leaned down to watch, and every living thing in that black amphitheater, loyal, traitor, mortal, demon, scholar, murderer, and dust-filled king alike, understood with animal certainty that whatever happened next would not remain a matter of one world's death. At the edge of the fire sea, where black stone terraces ended in heat haze and impossible light, the last truths of Varax came to argue with one another in the bodies of traitor kings. The amphitheater of the planetary heart shook around them. Cracks veined the soot-dark causeways. Gold script flashed and guttered along the tiered walls. Above, through miles of rent stone and cathedral ruin, the world still died by degrees too vast for mortal counting. Below, the sea of impossible flame rolled and heaved as though the core itself had become a living congregation. The ordered ash aspect circled one side of that abyss in pale, terrible majesty. The devotional blood flame pulsed on the other, swelling in crimson throbs that carried the phantom cadence of billions chanting, begging, dying. Between those predator stars stood Dark Apostle Malachar Vol and exalted sorcerer Menkaura, with the shredded remnants of their legions spread around them like offerings already accepted. For a few heartbeats, neither moved. Menkaura's barrier fire had thinned to hard blue skeins around his armor, guttering in the air as if exhausted by the violence required to sustain it. His face was drawn and bloodless beneath streaks of old blood. Witchlight crawled along the length of his staff and in the dead calm of his eyes. Around him remained only a fraction of the 1,000 suns who had entered the lower vaults. Scarab occult terminators, scorched and broken, their gold trim blackened by demon fire and blood. Rubricae with cracked breastplates and missing limbs, still standing because standing was all that remained to them. Sorcerers whose mouths ran crimson with the price of the rites they had forced upon the relic. Yet those survivors held formation with the same grave discipline as ever, silent as monuments to a grief older than empires. Across the causeway, Malachar Vol stood amid a congregation reduced to ruin and fury. His armor had become a reliquary of carnage. Black-red blood sheeted over the engraved scripture of his plate. One horn of his helm had been snapped near the base. His crozier smoked where blood flame had kissed it and not wholly released it. Around him knelt or prowled or staggered the remains of the 17th. Word-bearers with their parchment strips on fire. Possessed elites breathing through split. Rib cages and lamprey maws. Diabolists muttering through teeth caked in blood. Cult priests who had followed their masters all the way into the throat of a dying world and found even there more scripture to shout over the dead. The argument began in the old way, with contempt. Malachar's vox grill growled once before his voice rolled across the stone and over the impossible tide below. Look at you, son of Magnus. Still you posture. Still you carve little laws into the dark and imagine the dark obliged to obey. Even at the lip of annihilation, you cling to the coward's creed. Control, distance, the pathetic vanity of believing the warp may be dissected like a carcass and made to serve. Manara did not raise his voice in answer. He never had to. The weight in it was enough. And look at you, Apostle, knee-deep in your own dead and still preaching surrender as if it were revelation. You kneel to appetite and call it truth. You feed worlds into the maw of powers you do, not understand, and mistake submission for courage. Malachar spread his arms, the gesture half benediction and half threat. I do not kneel because I am weak, sorcerer. I kneel because there are truths greater than my own pride. No, Manara said. You kneel because you are too frightened to stand without a master's hand at your throat. The word-bearers behind Malachar snarled at that, a wave of helmeted rage and muttering blasphemy, but the Dark Apostle only laughed. There speaks the coward indeed. The sons of Prospero were always fragile beneath their gilded certainty, scholars clinging to their own intellect because they lacked the courage to adore anything beyond themselves. Manara took one step forward, only one. Yet the heat around him sharpened, and the air filled with fine drifting ash. And the 17th were always vermin, he said, a legion of cringing devotees who mistake degradation for enlightenment. You do not worship truth. You worship the sensation of your own surrender. The last word had not fully died when murder resumed. Rubricae opened fire in the same instant possessed elites bounded from the broken tiers. Inferno bolts crossed the chamber in blue-white streaks and burst through mutant flesh, ribs, and demon-thickened muscle. One possessed came apart at the waist, spilling black organs and writhing lengths of intestine over the causeway as it crashed down, still clawing. Another survived the first impact and launched itself bodily at a rubricae, talons punching through cobalt plate, while the corpse suit answered by driving the muzzle of its inferno bolter into the creature's throat and firing until head, neck, and half the upper torso ceased to exist. Scarab occult terminators met the rushing word-bearers on the tiered stone causeways with power blades and Kopesh strokes so hard that sparks and teeth flew in equal measure. One ancient warrior of Prospero thrust his blade clean through a legionary of the 17th and pinned him for an instant against a script-carved pillar. The impaled word-bearer seized the blade with both gauntlets, held himself on it by sheer hatred, and drove his own chain knife into the gap beneath the Terminator's gorget. Both toppled together into the fire sea below. Their armor burst apart on contact in two different explosions of color, one pale with ash, and one red-gold with screaming bloodlight, and the souls venting from them rose like banners in opposite hues before the flames devoured the distinction. Bodies fell constantly after that. A rubricae lost both legs to a roaring chain axe, toppled backward from the causeway, and struck the fire with a sound like a tomb opening. Grey ash erupted around the blue shell of its armor, while within the column of pale dust there sounded, impossibly, a low and mournful cry. A possessed with brass hooks driven through its flesh took a force stave to the sternum and was hurled shrieking over. The edge. As it fell, its body peeled open like wet parchment, and a cloud of little black winged things burst from the cavity where its lungs had once been. They screamed in infant voices all the way down. Malachar and Manara closed through that slaughter, striking at one another with all the long hatred of divergent damnation. The Apostle came first, with the Crozius low, then high, a butcher priest's feint, followed by a temple-shattering blow. Manara caught it on the haft of his staff, and the impact flashed through the chamber like a bell struck under water. Gold script on the nearby stone ignited. The sorcerer turned the force aside and answered with a lance of witchfire from his free hand. Malachar took it across one shoulder, staggered half a pace, and kept coming through the flame as if pain were merely another incense in the liturgy of war. He hammered the Crozius at Manara's ribs. The sorcerer twisted, but not fully. Ceramite cracked, blood sprayed dark across the black stone. Around them, their followers killed and died without restraint. Sabran the Diabolist, more demon than legionary now, saw the blood flame aspect circling over the abyss and lost the last chain of selfhood he had retained. He bellowed in two voices at once and hurled himself from the upper terrace toward the pulsing crimson star, claws spread, split flesh leaking black burning blood that hissed where it struck the stone. For one lunatic instant, it seemed he might actually reach it. Then the blood flame welcomed him, not as master, as fuel. It entered him through every wound he had opened in himself and through wounds not yet made. Sabran swelled grotesquely, armor plates peeling off as muscles and wet fire bulged beneath. His spine arched backward until it broke through his own skin in a crown of burning vertebrae. His mouth opened in a scream so wide the jaw tore free at one side. The demon inside him tried to howl its triumph and instead became part of the rupture. Sabran exploded into aperture. Where his body had been, there tore open a brief gate of wet red light, ringed with meat, brass, and script. Lesser horrors poured through in a frenzy. Hooked shapes of undivided hunger, fluttering avian flame things trailing impossible letters, crawlers made from hands and mouths alone. They hit the nearest fighters on both sides with ecstatic violence, clawing into eye lenses, burrowing beneath armor seals, sawing through throats with crystal talons. Manara sensed the breach and turned his head by the smallest degree. That was enough. Iset Kor chose his second betrayal. The half-charred sorcerer had lurked at the edge of Menkara's shrinking formation since the descent to the core, waiting behind dead brothers and living calculation alike. Now he struck from behind and above, riding the distraction like a knife hidden in prayer. His staff came down in a killing arc, aimed not at Menkara's back this time, but at the base of the skull where force barriers had already thinned under strain. He never landed the blow. Manara reacted without turning, as if some portion of the ash aspect already coiled through his nerves and thought. He thrust one gauntleted hand backward. Warp fire erupted point blank in a spear of such concentrated brilliance that it erased Iset Kor almost before the chamber registered he had been there. Flesh, armor, bone, ambition, all atomized in a blast of pale blue annihilation. When the flare died, nothing remained of the would-be usurper save smoking fragments of armor, a handful of blackened teeth bouncing across the stone, and a patch of wall behind him turned to vitrified slag. Malachar laughed as he swung again. See, sorcerer, even your own blood knows mastery is a lie. Manara parried and drove the butt of his staff into Malachar's wounded side, hard enough to cave armor inward. And yours knows submission is cannibalism dressed as prayer. Halbrecht Vane heard little of that exchange in any coherent way. He had reached the final seal nexus beneath the lowest terrace by then, half crawling, half dragged by the converging currents of the relic and the failing mechanisms of the pyrocrypt. The chamber was little more than a ring of ancient reactor housings around a central shaft, through which heat climbed like a living breath. Brass black pressure locks trembled in their casings. Warning sigils older than the Imperium flashed in patterns his bloodline suddenly knew how to read. The last seals held the whole core in reluctant discipline. He had already broken too many for return. These final ones would not merely sabotage containment, they would turn the planetary heart into a detonation chamber. Halbrecht braced one hand against the housing to keep from vomiting from the heat and terror both. He thought of the pilgrims crushed in the plazas, of the hidden archivists before him who had lied so faithfully and yet known so little, of Rest and the Last, soldiers of Varax ground between red devotion and blue arithmetic, of the simple enormity of the crime below and the certainty that no victory for either legion could be allowed to leave this place. There is no righteousness left, he whispered to no god that had earned hearing him. Only refusal. Then he triggered the chain. The first seal ruptured with a shriek. Steam and black fire exploded from the housing, tearing skin from his arm and throwing him backward into the floor. The second and third answered an instant later from deeper below, and the whole planetary heart convulsed. Somewhere in the amphitheater above, stone terraces split. The fire sea surged. the two relic aspects flared in alarm or delight. Manara felt it at once and understood. If he fled now, he would lose everything. If he remained and sought total mastery, he would lose everything and deserve it. There remained only one viable theft from catastrophe. He broke from Malachar with a pulse of force that sent the apostles skidding across blood-slick stone, then turned all surviving Thousand Suns' effort toward the ordered ash aspect. The command he gave was not shouted. It did not need to be. The remaining rubricae moved into sacrificial alignment. Scarab occult terminators sealed the outer approaches, locking themselves into killing stances against the incoming possessed and demon spill. Sorcerers began to die at once under the strain of the new rite, their flesh drying on their bones even as they chanted. Manara cast a rune prison in the air before the descending ash aspect, each line written not only in light, but in the lives of his remaining brothers. Every dead-filled suit became an anchor, every sorcerer a living seal. The lattice closed around the pale star in narrowing layers. The backlash was hideous. Rubricae burst open where they stood, armor splitting to vent geysers of grey ash that whirled into the prison geometry. Sorcerers ignited from the inside, eyes and mouths pouring white-blue fire before collapsing into black skeletons inside their own gilded plate. Scarab occult terminators held the line while their brothers died behind them, taking chain blades through the chest, demon talons under the helm, blood flame across the faceplate, all without stepping aside. Manara kept the prison forming with both hands and with the whole savage force of his will. One shard, he told himself. One shard of meaning torn free from a world-sized obscenity. And somehow, through slaughter enough to damn any archive attempting to record it, he succeeded. A shard of the ash aspect, no larger than a helm, and no smaller than a star in implication, tore loose from the greater manifestation and slammed into the forming rune prison. The lattice snapped shut around it with a scream like 10,000 dead scholars denied remembrance. Manara staggered and nearly fell. Around him, nearly all remaining Thousand Suns in the chamber were dead, dispersed, as ash, broken, burning, or emptied beyond motion. But the shard remained bound. Across the amphitheatre, Malachar Vol saw what had been taken and knew he had lost the relic's wholeness. He had also lost too much blood to lie to himself about survival. Manara's staff had broken ribs and burst organs beneath his armor. Blood flame crawling over him had eaten through seals and into the meat of his side and left one arm half numb and smoking. Yet even dying, the Dark Apostle remained what he had always been. Not a conqueror of practical things, a defiler of meaning. He rose amid the dead and the broken demons and the screaming lower fire, planted his boots wide on the cracking black stone, and hammered the head of his Crozius into the floor. The impact rang through the chamber and down into the splitting core below. Malachar threw back his helm. His face was a ruin of scar tissue, fresh blood, and furnace-lit exultation. He raised his voice for the last time, and it carried, not only through the amphitheatre, but upward through every open crack, every vox conduit, every wounded sanctum and burning habcell of Varax. If I cannot crown this fire, he roared, then let the world itself wear it. Let every shrine become a wound. Let every oath become ash. Let every dead throat on this faith-fat planet sing damnation into the abyss. I give you Varax entire, not as kingdom, as prayer. The stone answered. So did the world. The sabotage seals below the amphitheatre all failed together. The fire sea convulsed upward. Blood flame and ashlight twisted around one another and became for one impossible instant a single towering spear of blasphemous radiance. Then the planetary core erupted. It drove upward through the black terraces and the lower vaults and the hidden libraries beneath the Basilica like a lance through flesh. It punched through the central hive in a pillar wide as a city district, vaporizing vaults, cathedra, cult congregations, Thousand Suns dead, word-bearers living, and every hidden lie between. It roared on through the upper hives, through bridge cities and shrine tiers and manufactorum crowns. It tore through the cloud layer in a column of screaming gold, crimson, blue, and corpse-black fire. It split the poisoned skies of Varax and kept going. In orbit, fleets still dueling through debris and burning hulks were suddenly lit from below by a sun being born wrong. The pillar of blasphemous fire punched out into space, spearing wreckage, flensing hulls, washing over battle barges and cruisers alike with world death made radiant. For one vast moment, Varax hung beneath it like a skull with its spine of flame exposed to the void. Then the shockwave came for everything that still remained. The fire did not end when it reached the void. It remained for a long and abominable while, as a pillar joining world and starless dark in one continuous act of desecration. Even after the first impossible surge had spent itself upward through hive, cloud, and orbit, the wound it left behind went on burning. Varax had been opened too deeply for simple death. The planetary core, once hidden beneath liturgy, stone, and generational fraud, now glared through the broken crust in pulses of corpse-black, arterial crimson, and ash-pale light. The hives that had girded the world like crowns and shackles alike were no longer cities in any meaning that living men could inhabit. They had become testimonies. Some hive continents collapsed inward. Their vast habitation tiers, processional roads, cathedral foundations, and manufactorum trenches slid by the mile into widening chasms that glowed from beneath with infernal brilliance. Whole urban masses vanished in successive thunderclaps of failing support and detonating gas lines, dropping into the molten wounds below, with all the slow grandeur of mountains being swallowed. Other regions vitrified where the worst of the pyromantic surge and relic backlash had met. There the city was no longer rubble, but black glass. Spires stood frozen like obsidian knives thrust from a dead giant's hand. Processional avenues became smooth, dark rivers of fused stone, in which the outlines of those caught while fleeing remained visible, hundreds and thousands together, trapped inside the glass as stretched silhouettes of terror, prayer, and astonishment. Elsewhere the hives still stood, though no mercy lived in that. They rose as flaming mausoleums, upper tiers burning endlessly, window by window and shrine by shrine, the chambers within packed with ash drifts, collapsed altars, and skeletons fused together, where heat and ritual had welded entire congregations into one final posture of shared extinction. The skies of Varax had become their own scripture of ruin. Ash circled in continent-wide storms. Warp light bled through the cloud mantle in bruised veils. The remains of the orbital ring fell in burning fragments that trailed iron smoke through the upper atmosphere before smashing into already dying districts. Every horizon burned. Every horizon also broke. The thousand suns withdrew first, not in triumph, not with banners raised or victory cries cast into the void. Their retreat had the cold, wounded efficiency of a legion that knew too much to lie to itself. Manara Setep emerged from the lower cataclysm bearing the imprisoned shard within a rune prison of smoking gold and pale script, a geometric casket that floated at his side and screamed soundlessly at the edge of vision. Around him remained only a ragged remnant of the force he had brought into the heart of Varax. Scarab occult terminators whose armor had cracked and blackened under forces no forge had intended them to endure. Rubricae reduced to incomplete shells still marching because some last command impulse remained sealed inside the dust. Sorcerers burned hollow-eyed by the rites, blood caked from nose and mouth and ears, every step purchased at the cost of fresh tremors in the hand or fresh sparks crawling beneath the skin. No one among them spoke of mastery. Manara himself did not need to. His silence carried the truth more clearly than any confession could have done. He had gained the theorem's shard. He had torn one ashborn fragment of meaning out of a world-sized sacrificial engine before that engine consumed itself and everything around it. Yet the price stood all around him in dead brothers, shattered warcraft, and a future grown only more uncertain by possession of the very thing he had risked all to claim. The shard's prison pulsed against his presence like a captured wound. He could feel its promise. He could also feel its mockery. It was not mastered, Not truly. It had only agreed, for the moment, to travel in chains. That was the purest shape of Thousand Suns' victory. Knowledge won, certainty lost, power obtained in a form that deepened damnation rather than curing it. Their extraction from Varax's ruin was carried out through corridors of falling black stone and open sky where there had once been hive roofing. Surviving teleport relays flickered in the ash haze, cutting blue-gold wounds in reality through which the sons of Prospero vanished by squads and then by dwindling handfuls. Elsewhere, gunships and battered shuttles descended under half-functioning shields to retrieve those still able to march. Manara was among the last taken from the surface, not from nobility, but because he would not allow the shard out of his sight for even the span of a loading ramp's clatter. He looked back once, and in that one measured turn of the head, there was neither sentiment nor relief, only calculation, grief buried under use, and the cold understanding that Varax would not be the end of what had been begun here. The word-bearers also claimed victory. That was the obscenity of the thing. Malachar Vol had not survived the full eruption in anything a chronicler of sane wars would recognize as survival. Whether his final prayer left anything coherent of him beyond scorched flesh, half-burned armor, and a voice still echoing through the warp was a question his surviving sons did not trouble themselves to answer plainly. They did not require their apostles' living presence in order to interpret the result. Varax had become exactly what the 17th most loved to make of a world. Not merely conquered, not merely ruined, consecrated through suffering. A billion throats had cried out in terror, devotion, madness, and pain. A planet's death scream had been hurled bodily into the Empyrean. The pyres, pits, chants, mutilations, betrayals, and final world-breaking detonation had all combined into a single act of worship, visible from the void and audible in the warp. The word-bearers needed no better vindication. They moved through the surviving ruins like priests after a feast day sacrifice, gathering relic fragments, wounded brothers, still screaming prisoners, and whatever scripture-charged debris might carry the memory of the world's fall to the next killing ground. Cult cells that had survived the catastrophe emerged from collapsed underhives and burning barrack crypts to kneel among the ash. Surviving apostles preached over fields of black glass and fused dead, promising those broken enough to hear them that Varax had not perished in punishment, but in revelation. Already the 17th were planting what they always planted after devastation. Missionaries, hidden catechists, new lies with hooks in them. The world itself had become their sermon, and sermons were not meant to die with the first audience. Dreor Celt died in the upper ruins, beneath the same cathedral weight he had helped profane. He had climbed back toward the broken Basilica district by instinct deeper than strategy, carving a road through the last defenders, the maddened, the mutated, and the simply unfortunate. What remained of loyal resistance there was scarcely resistance at all by then. Fragments of enforcer cadres, shrine wardens half deaf from bombardment, PDF survivors with empty charge packs using rifle stocks as clubs, penitent madmen who thought the end itself absolved all fear. Dreor killed them with the same workmanlike contempt he had shown from the first breach. His chain axe tore through collarbones and skulls. Bolt rounds burst bodies open on shrine steps black with soot and blood. He strode through demon fire and falling brass bells as though each were only another inconvenience in a long day's labour. When the western nave of the Basilica of the Emperor Ascendant finally came down, it came with the roar of something old and arrogant learning humility too late. Great sections of vaulting, sunk statues, hanging censers, and fortress-grade stonework sheared loose and plunged into the district below. Dreor looked up once, just once, enough to know what came. Then he planted his boots and killed the last defender within reach, splitting the man from shoulder to hip, while the cathedral died overhead. The falling mass buried him with the rest. When the ash settled, Only the broken teeth of the Basilica remained above the rubble, and beneath that mountain of sanctified ruin lay the corifice of the word-bearers, entombed at last under the weight of the same false holiness he had spent his life teaching worlds to mock. Halbrecht Vane survived the heart of Varax only because the world had not yet decided which cruelty to finish with first. The blast from the final seal ruptures had thrown him through collapsing access shafts, across broken maintenance galleries, and into a half-buried exterior crypt vent where black daylight and ash storm waited. He emerged not as a victor, nor even properly as a survivor, but as a thing the catastrophe had not gotten around to consuming in full. One arm had been flayed nearly to the elbow by steam and reactor flash. The left side of his face was a red ruin where heat had cooked skin and burst vessels. Blood coughed from his lungs in short, wet fits that left threads of red hanging from his lips. Still he crawled. He dragged himself out from under the broken crypt lip and into the open ash beneath a sky that no longer possessed any right to call itself sky. The cloud mantle burned in slow, diseased colours. Fire glowed under the horizon in every direction. The air tasted of metal, cinders, and the sweet rot of cooked flesh. Around him, the dead of Varax lay in all the postures of the betrayed. Pilgrims clutching rosaries melted into their own hands. Cultists burned down to grinning skulls. PDF men sprawled face down in the ash, where they had tried to make a line and found only ending. Far away, if distance could still be trusted, something huge screamed and kept screaming until the sound thinned into the wind. Halbrecht raised his head and looked for rescue. There was none. No thunder of descending angels of death loyal to terror. No columns of relief, armor pushing through the ash. No saintly deliverance, no justice. The world had been used too thoroughly and too quickly for such courtesies. He saw only retreating lights in the upper atmosphere where traitor vessels and a dwindling handful of transports withdrew through debris and fire. The lesson struck him harder than any blow he had taken in the vaults. Not that chaos had come. That had always been possible in the abstract, a thing in histories and sermons. The true obscenity was narrower and more exact. Two different visions of chaos had found Varax useful. That was the truth worth preserving, if anything could still be preserved. Halbrecht fumbled at the corpse of a Vox serf, half buried in the ash nearby, and tore free a cracked Vox scroll unit no bigger than a prayer book. The screen was spider-webbed. One side of the casing had melted and re-hardened. He spat blood across the activation stud, struck it twice with his burned palm, and got a weak green lumen in answer. Recording rune. Fragmentary storage. Enough. He brought it close to his ruined mouth and forced the words through lungs that wanted only to drown. This is Brother Archivist Halbrecht Vane of the Basilica Order of Varax. Let this stand where fuller records cannot. He coughed, retched blood, and went on because to stop was to die wordless. The world was not merely invaded. It was interpreted. One host came in worship, one came in knowledge. Both found us of value. Let no man who hears this imagine one form of damnation cleaner than the other. They differed in doctrine, they agreed in utility. We were fuel to each. He looked up once at the burning heavens, perhaps searching for the Emperor, perhaps only for more words. None came from above. Do not record merely that chaos came, he whispered. Record that it had two mouths, and both fed. The Vox scroll clicked as memory space failed. Halbrecht kept it clutched to his chest anyway. He crawled a little farther, across the ash, perhaps toward nothing, perhaps toward an old instinct for sanctuary no longer matched by the world. Then the blood finally filled his lungs beyond any further argument, and Brother Archivist Halbrecht Vane died under the open ruin of his city, with no saints in sight. Imperial relief flotillas arrived too late to save anything worth the name of saving. They came from neighbouring routes and delayed muster points, called by fractured distress astropathy, broken military transmissions, and the long silence where a pilgrim hive world should have continued reporting tithes, prayers, and orderly misery. By the time their augurs acquired full visual confirmation, Varax was no longer a proper world in the old administrative sense. It hung in the void as a cinder orb half wrapped in warp storm, its atmosphere convulsing, its surface traced by continental fires and intermittent core flares that made Auspec's logic snarl itself into useless knots. Debris fields still orbited it. Scattered traitor signatures withdrew under warp concealment or fled at impossible vectors. Rescue doctrine collapsed under the scale of contamination and the certainty that whatever had occurred below was neither finished nor containable by ordinary means. What survivors remained on the surface offered little comfort to the observers above. Some were mad, wandering the black glass plains in processional patterns while reciting prayers to gods their grandfathers had never named. Some were mutated beyond viable classification, their bodies rewritten by fire, ash, and the touch of a relic none of them had seen. Some were already enslaved by the hidden catechists and surviving warbands of the word-bearers, herded into fresh congregations under the ruins. Some simply burned, not consumed, but continuing to burn in pockets and cracks and chapel crypts where the world's death had left embers no rain or vacuum could quench. Quarantine recommendations were drafted. Exterminatus was debated in clipped, terrified voices. Astropaths bled from the nose and eyes when attempting clean readings of the warp conditions around the world. The relief flotillas, righteous in their delay and helplessness alike, became witnesses rather than saviors. And so the legions left their marks in the only ways traitor legions ever truly do. The Thousand Suns withdrew with their shard, a fragment of ordered ash imprisoned in rune lattice and attended by a warlord who had won enough to deepen his own damnation. Somewhere beyond Varax, that shard would be studied, coveted, argued over, perhaps fought over. It would whisper theorem into the minds of sorcerers and promise impossible revisions to flesh, destiny, and memory. Another war would likely grow around it, because such things never became quieter once found. The word-bearers withdrew with no such fragmentary restraint. They left missionaries among the ash, hidden cult seeds in sump vaults and shipwrecked chapels and refugee knots, too traumatized to know revelation from predation. They left sermons embedded in vox loops and blood-written catechisms nailed under collapsed bridges. They left the interpretation of Varax's death to men eager to hear in catastrophe the voice of gods. Their prize was not portable, it was planetary, a world made into evidence. In the end, Varax remained, not as a shrine world, not as a functioning hive, not as an object lesson simple enough for imperial history to file cleanly under heresy, suppressed or tragedy endured. It remained as the title it had earned in the mouths of those few who would later whisper of it with proper dread. The war of blasphemous fire had written its final line across the planet's flesh. Seen from the void, after the fleets had gone and the relief ships had fallen back into wary orbit, Varax hung against the dark like a scripture-charred skull. Its continents were traced by lines of fire that never went out. They ran through broken hive crowns, along fault wounds, across black glass plains, down into the opened core, and back again in slow arterial glows, as though some giant unseen hand had inscribed the whole world in burning scripture and then left it there for the galaxy to contemplate without hope of reply.